I'll call him. All right, folks. Take your hymn books. We're going to sing one more song, then get a report on what's happening on the internet. 442. Take your hymn books. And we're going to stand up again to do this. You're going to be sitting down for a good little while, so let's stand up. 442.
How sweet are the tidings that great King as he wanders in exile from home. Soon, soon will the Savior glory appear, and soon will the kingdom come. He's coming, coming, coming soon, I know. Coming back to this earth again, and the weary pilgrim will to glory go when the Savior comes to reign. The most in voice repeat himself when it's death before, and the millions asleep in the mighty deep shall live on this earth once more. He's coming, coming, coming soon, I know. Coming back to this earth again, and the weary pilgrims will to glory go when the Savior comes to reign. There will be not in Eden home, sweet songs of redemption will sing. From the north, from the south, all the joys drum to come and worship our heavenly King. He is coming, 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 spring I know. Coming back to this earth again, and the weary pilgrims will to glory go when the Savior comes to reign. Hallelujah, amen, hallelujah again. Soon His faithful we sure shall be there. Oh, be watchful, be hopeful, be joyful till then, and a crown of my glory will wear. It's coming, coming, coming soon, I know. Coming back to this earth again, and the weary pilgrims will to glory go when the Savior comes to reign.
Please be seated. You sound very, very good. Pastor Michael is pastor here with us as an expert in social media, and we've asked him to give us a little update on what is the audience like that's not here. All right, so take just a minute or two and let us know.
All right, it's very easy to feel like we're just a few people here looking at this building, but we have quite a number of people that are joining us online. So we are live streaming both on Facebook and on YouTube. So this morning, for this morning presentation or panel discussion, we've been joined online by around 300 people, both on Facebook and on YouTube. So I'm just going to mention a few of the places or countries or different regions of the world that people have been viewing from. People have been viewing from Bhutan, from India, from Maryland here in the United States, from the Middle East, from Philippines, from Tahiti, from New York, from Mexico, from Canada, and from Seychelles. So these are just a few places that I have just gathered, but of course we have a lot more places or regions of the world that people are tuning in from.
All right, very good. So we are in a large auditorium, so the 60 or so of us that are here don't really fill it up, but it is full with a desire to learn, good scholarship, good spirit, and I think it's time for us to go to our next segment. So scholars, if you'll take to the platform, and we'll ask Dr. Vine to start us on the journey.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Once again, it's a pleasure to be welcoming you back to our afternoon session. This morning, we tried to cover some areas where we assumed before this conference there was broad agreement, and we discovered that there are some areas where we can still grow and learn from each other. And this afternoon, we're going to focus on some of those texts listed out in your anchor and divergence texts. We're going to try and get up to verse 40 by 5 o'clock. Tomorrow we want to cover the time of the end, the King of the North right then, when everybody's present. Our main congregation will be with us. So that's kind of the roadmap for this afternoon. And to start us out, we concluded before our lunch break with a discussion of whether, when does Rome appear in this prophecy, particularly in verse 14. Now, this is significant because many Adventist interpreters have Rome coming in on the scene in verse 16, the arrival of Rome and the conquest by Pompey of the beautiful land, or of Palestine or Israel. And what we heard this morning from Dr. Gane, who's written an article on this, was that actually from verse 14 to verse 18 we have the career of Antiochus III Magnus, which puts Rome further back in the chapter. And one of the points you made, Dr. Gane, was that we always assume that the daughter who's mentioned there in verse 17, the daughter of women to destroy it, we've all assumed, myself included, that this was Cleopatra, the last of the Ptolemies. But what you're suggesting to us is quite opposite. It could not possibly be Cleopatra for a variety of reasons, and therefore this fits better into the Antiochus III understanding. Now, I hate to admit this, and maybe this is a moment of profound weakness, but you were almost convincing me to change my pre-held views on the matter. And I'm willing to admit I probably was wrong before. But to just kind of drill down into this a bit more, you've explained to us that the history doesn't fit of verse 17 being Cleopatra. Okay, so I accept that. I hope many of us in the audience do as well. But what in the Hebrew itself from 14 to 18 would actually indicate an understanding of Magnus himself?
Okay, before this, and we can't get into all the details from verse 5 on, there's a very intricate profile of events that has really quite a specific fulfillment in history. One semester at Andrews University, Dr. Randy Younker and I team taught a class on Daniel 11. We ran out of a semester before we ran out of Daniel 11, I can assure you. But one thing we did do is, he's an expert in history and archaeology. And so he was looking at the history. I was working on analyzing the text with doctoral students. It was a doctoral seminar. And we were putting the two together. And we found really complete agreement all the way up through verse 19 with the history into Antiochus III the Great. I think one of the reasons why Adventist interpreters want to get out of the Seleucids before that, they don't want to get too close to Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who's the son of Antiochus the Great. In any case, what we have here is Antiochus III is already in here, verses 13, 14, and following. And then if we just trace the pronouns, the pronouns continue as being, of course, the same dynasty. You would say dynasty. And then the events fit very closely the history of the reign of this particular king. Now, it's a bit, I use the analogy in my article in the Journal of Adventist Theological Society of tree rings. How do you do tree ring dating? And that is, if you have to match, or DNA would be another example. Well, if you go to the store and you just use one of these barcodes, how does a barcode work? See, it's a pattern of thin and thick and so on lines, right? And tree rings are thinner or thicker depending upon how fertile, how much rain there was that year and that kind of stuff. And so what you're looking for is a pattern. And if you just go with one or two things to correlate, you can say, it could be this, could be this, could be this. For example, if I say to you, who was a European conqueror who conquered most of Europe and then invaded Russia and was defeated because of the Russian winter? Who is that? Well, Napoleon or Hitler, see? But if you add some other things, then you progressively reduce the possibility of confusion. There are just too many details that are too specific, and this is very specific in verse 17. The reason why I said I was rather dogmatic that it's not Cleopatra VII, Cleopatra VII was a Ptolemy. She was from the south. Mm-hmm. And here we have the king of the north, who is the one giving this woman. She is not a Ptolemy. She is from the north. She is a Seleucid, even though her name is Cleopatra, both of them. They're all Greek, right? And so it would be like saying that Jackie Kennedy is from Florida. You know, I mean, it just doesn't work. And so this is clearly from the north. And in fact, Antiochus III did give his daughter Cleopatra I for the reason to destroy the southern kingdom of Ptolemy V, who had been weakened a bit, and he wanted to take over the south through marriage. He hadn't been able to completely do it through battle. He had gained the upper hand, but he wanted to take over Egypt for his dynasty, and he tried to do that through a political marital alliance. But it says it shall not be stand or be to his advantage, and the reason for that is because she ended up being loyal to her husband. So her father couldn't do anything about it. It just fits too perfectly, and it doesn't fit with Cleopatra VII at all.
Okay, Jerome?
Sure. Before I make my point, I just want to let everyone know, a little bit before 4 o'clock, those two beautiful girls in the back I have to take somewhere. So I won't be getting up and leaving because I disagree with the point or am upset with something someone says.
Glad you told us, Jerome.
I just wanted to let you know that.
We're relieved.
It's because I have to take my two beautiful daughters somewhere.
The text does say that he shall take his stand. Yes.
So just to make a point about something Roy was saying, when I went home, I read Daniel 11 again, just in one setting. If you look at the structure of chapter 11, verse 17, 18, and 19, you'll notice that they all start the same way. It's vayasem panav. So that could be an indication that we are just looking at one power. So if someone tried to break up the continuity to say that Rome started in between here, they would have to show structurally that that was the case, I should rather say. So whether it is indeed, as Roy has said, or if people can show from 16 that Rome is in the picture, 17 through 19 have continuity on the structural level. So I just wanted to make that point to say I could see the trajectory of his argumentation when it comes to the structure.
It's interesting because that simply doesn't come through into our English translations, the continuity of expression in the Hebrew. Yes, Pastor Ed Nelson.
So I have kind of a two-part question. The first one's quick. So what Roy is suggesting to us is that the history of Antiochus III is depicted from verse 15, at least, or from verse...
It's earlier than that. It starts earlier than that.
It's 10, right? It's 10, all the way down through 19, right? So I wanted to ask the panel members, is everyone pretty much in agreement with that view, or are there differences, or are there people that still aren't sure?
I just want to offer a quick response beyond our panel. That is actually the general consensus of critical scholarship, as well as some of us perhaps up here on the panel, and I am one of them. The reasons why that might be so for the critical scholars has to do with the issues of the structure of the chapter. And that's an issue we may want to look into more in a moment.
I agree with Roy's explanation.
There's one thing that comes out of this, and that is this chapter takes us to the height of the Seleucid Empire. Antiochus III expanded it to its greatest extent. And then he attacked Rome, and then he drops out of the picture. There's a parallel with what happens with Greece and Persia, because Persia gets to that great king Xerxes, he attacks Greece, he's defeated by Greece, and then you don't hear from Persia. It moves to the next power. That's what happens here. Antiochus III goes up, he attacks Rome, he loses to Rome, and then the chapter moves to Rome. So we have this kind of a parallel going on. And you have gaps after that, of course, in the lines of the Seleucids, because Antiochus III was the 7th out of a line of 20 Seleucid kings. And you only go through 7, he loses to Rome, and then you don't hear of the rest of them. It moves to Rome.
Mm-hmm. So the second part of my question, it relates to verse 16 specifically. As I've studied Daniel 8 and 11 and compared the two, I've noticed a pattern of ascension, dominion, and will. And the word that's used for ascension, amad, to stand up, is not always indicative of a new empire. It's just, oftentimes, it's just someone stands in his place. You have a new ruler coming onto the scene. You have a new emperor. But in verse 3, it's very clear that more than that is happening, because verse 3 tells us that a mighty king will, amad, stand up. And then it talks about the extent of his dominion will be great, which reminds us of the 3 empires of Daniel 8, great, very great, exceedingly great. And then it says this phrase, he will do according to his will. Well, he exerts his unilateral will, no one can oppose him. And then verse 4 gives us confirmation that this is the same kingdom that was divided 4 ways. Well, I see that same, a lot of that same in verse 16, because you have verse 16, he that cometh against him, as I understand this is Rome, this is the way that I've read it, Rome coming against Antiochus III shall, and then you have do according to his will, the very same phrase that we saw. And then it says, and he shall, no one shall stand. So he's standing, he's rising, no one stands before him. And then it gives us the extent of his dominion that will include the glorious land. And when you go back to chapter 8, there's only one of the 3 powers that specifically mentions the Sabi, the glorious land, and that is the little horn. And then in Daniel 8:23, it tells us at the latter time of the Greek kingdom, a power will arise that has a fierce face. And here in verse 16 is the very first time, it's not in the English, but it says, no one shall stand before his face. And as Brother Skinner mentioned, the very next verse says, then he will turn his face. And the next verse says, then he will turn his face. The verse after that says, then he will turn his face. So for all these reasons taken together, and Frank Hardy also has noticed this, he'll do according to his will, and he played on that specific item to say, here's the introduction of Rome. But to me, for all of these reasons together, I find very compelling evidence to see Rome as the player that is entering here onto the scene. I mean, that's my opinion. That's how I've seen it. Anyway.
Okay, we have 2 more people with their hands up. We'll take Brother Kim first, and then Brother Brendan.
If some of them want to go ahead to reply, this is fine.
Does any of you want to reply?
Go ahead, Mike.
Well, this is obviously a very challenging and controverted portion of the text that Adventists in particular have struggled over. The question of structure is an important one, and I can offer how I see it, a perspective that is trying to piece together what's happening in the narrative along with history. It is very hard to read the text without history, and it may not be useful to read the history without the text. They do go together. But it is interesting that there are some patterns that may provide some hints within both Daniel 11 itself, as well as intratextually throughout the rest, or thematically throughout the rest of Daniel. I do find it interesting, if I may suggest this, that of course, as Adventist interpreters are well aware, there are four major powers presented in chapters 2, chapter 7, chapter 8, of course, eliminates one of them, and then the big question is, it seems like there's again maybe only 3 in chapter 11 as well, so 8 and 11 are a little bit more parallel. But there are 4 major powers, that's the point. In chapters 2 and chapter 7, there's clearly 4 major world powers that come into place. In chapter 7, a lot of emphasis is given on the fact that, and chapter 8, possibly, that's what's been discussed. But in chapter 7, it's very clear that the last power, which we understand to be Rome, has 2 major phases. And this is also evident in chapter 2. You have the iron legs, and then you have the toes, which are mixed iron with clay. So you have 2 major phases to the 4th major power. In chapter 8, and also hinted at just a little bit in chapter 7 if you're reading it very closely, but in chapter 8 it becomes very clear that also the 3rd major power, which is Greece, we understand to be Greece, also has 2 major phases. It's very clearly, Alexander the Great, and then there is the 4, portions, the 4 directions that his kingdom is broken into. So that's 2 major phases. Thematically, it's quite clear. The question is what's happening in Daniel 11? Well, if you actually do follow some of the Hebrew hints that, at least to me, stand out, you do see there are actually only exactly four major occurrences of ve'amad, and he will stand. So you have 4 times that you do have someone stand up to begin a verse. The verb amad does occur more times than just 4 in Daniel 11, but there are only 4 times that it begins a verse. In the proposal that I know that Roy and I share, this does well delineate the 2 phases each of the latter 2 powers. That's kind of our proposal. And so you do see Alexander in verse 3 stand up, and he will stand. And then in verse 4 it also does begin again with he will stand, but this is obviously a continuation of why his power doesn't last long. It's immediately broken apart. So you see he stands, but then it's broken apart. And I should also add that ve'amad is not the only word that I'm looking at, but I'll go ahead and finish that sequence. And then to begin a phrase, you then have it in 11:7. Someone finally, after an attempted alliance, it's very clear in verses 5 and 6 that you have the south kind of arises. He doesn't stand yet, he arises. He just appears, he becomes strong. The king of the south becomes strong. Then you have another one emerge that becomes evidently the king of the north. They try and make an alliance, but they can't figure it out. So you're reading it narratively. They can't figure out who's really the dominant power. Then in verse 7, finally, out of the root of the king of the south, you actually have one emerge. This is narratively speaking, but also it matches history. You have Ptolemy finally emerge as the one who is dominant. He will stand in his place, and I'd be interested to hear some comments on what his place means. The verb is kano. Who exactly is his place? Is it referring to verse 4 or 5 and 6, or is it actually referring back to Alexander? So you finally have one arising as the dominant one of the second phase of Greece in Alexander's place as the new real dominant king of Greece, the remainder of Greece. Now, what is interesting is that historically, the Ptolemies, that is the king of the south, actually controlled from this time onward Jerusalem and most of what we would call Israel for the next quite some time. For the next over a century, really, is how long they controlled it. And so what the story is saying is that the king of the south is the one that controls, and historically, if you're reading history with the text, the king of the south controls Jerusalem for basically quite a long time, while the king of the north is trying to take it, and he can't succeed until finally, and here I'm just going along, this goes with the flow of historical critical scholarship. Finally, it so happens that the king of the north finally wins the fight. He finally wins the battle, and he conquers Jerusalem, but he doesn't actually eliminate the king of the south. So again, reading it narratively, the south is still there, but he finally controls Jerusalem. So he is free to do as he wills in Israel, which is the focus of the prophecy. But then he tries to, and you can say it's kind of a bookend, narratively speaking, because at the beginning of the narrative, they try and form an alliance, but it doesn't really work out. And at the very end, they try and form an alliance for some unstated purpose, which history may reveal some answers to, but it doesn't work out. And then in verse 20, now someone stands in his place. and that would represent, logically speaking, a new entity, especially since in verse 19 it says he will no longer be found anymore. This particular point in the narrative, it actually says he won't be found anymore, and that is perhaps a good hint that we've seen the end of a dynasty. And then 20 and 21 might represent, of course, in our proposal, the two entrance phases of the power of Rome. But I'll rest there for a moment.
All right, Brother Ed, does that answer your question?
It didn't engage with any of the material I shared, so not really.
No. Okay.
If I may, I was trying to respond to why the key words, I just want to conclude this because it does address your question, I think, is in verse 3, Alexander stands and rules with his pleasure. So he stands and rules with his pleasure, which included over Jerusalem. Now, the narrative doesn't care too much about Alexander the Great in the sense of the details of his relatively short reign, about 10 years, which is interesting. After that, of the four powers, the king of the south finally stands in his place, in Alexander's place, and rules Jerusalem for a very long time, although the king of the north is always trying to attack it. What the narrative is sharing is that there's a kind of an ironic twist to this story because the king of the north and the south kind of have a relationship. They started with an attempted alliance, which is finally overruled when the king of the north conquers the king of the south and rules as he wills for about 10 years, the same length as Alexander, over Jerusalem, which is reflected perhaps in verse 16. So narratively speaking, the second phase of Greece, as alluded to in chapter 8, is this king of the north finally ruling as he wills, mirroring what Alexander the Great did. So it's actually, narratively speaking, it is making sense, and it makes sense that he takes Alexander's place to do as he did.
So my question is that conclusive proof that this has to be a Grecian entity? Is that conclusive?
Well, maybe I'll jump in here. You see, if in verse 17 you're still in the reign of Antiochus III, and if this is a chronological narrative, then you can't have Rome taking over before 17. And secondly, in verse 16 at the beginning of the verse, it just says, but he who comes against him, and that's referring to the one who has defeated the king of the south in verse 15. So it's the same king of the north, which is Antiochus III, who's defeated the king of the south in verse 15. It's the same person. It's not introducing another player, namely Rome.
And this is hinted, if I may, it is of interest, but in verse 15 actually prepares the narrative directly for 16 because it says that the king of the south won't be able to stand. And then the king of the north immediately comes in with a vav consecutive, narratively saying that he will now rule as he wills.
Well, I won't waste more of our time on this, but I don't see it as conclusively as you seem to be suggesting it. For me, this panim, this face figure, this is pretty compelling, along with the three: ascension, the will, and dominion that was established from Daniel 8.
You just have to remember that one thing, and that is just because a phrase or something, an expression is used of one person, doesn't mean that if you find that same phrase or expression in another place, it couldn't be another person, depending upon the context. Now, it could be, but you have to look at other factors in the context as well. So that's the issue. Yeah.
Okay,
Let me just have a question of clarification. The word amad in verses 20 and 21. Do I understand that correctly, Roy and Michael, that this refers to a new power on the scene each time?
Yes.
Okay. Let me just, I'm not totally convinced. I think amad is a very important word. It's a key word in Daniel 11. Mm-hmm. But look at Daniel 12, verse 1. We all agree that the vision, or the actually, it's not a vision, right? It's the telling of the truth, does not end in 1145. It continues. And in 12:1, that is clearly a new power. We all agree on that. In that time, Michael Ya'amot, he stands up. Does that open the possibility that an Ya'amot could also be like a change for power if it introduces a new topic like Michael? I'm thinking about maybe verse, let's see, where are the Rabbim?
Verse 36.
36. I'm actually looking for something else here. Verse 14. You have also a temporal phrase there, uva itim, hahem, well, after these times, and then you have rabim yamdu. Is that change of power? Probably not, of course, because it's Ve'amat. But if we would establish that a usual imperfect would also do if something else comes in front, then we would have several phrases like this. So I would go along and say Amat could infer a new king, a new reign, maybe even a new power, but it's not absolutely conclusive for me that Ve'amat is the one which have these four things separated.
You're talking about verses 20 and 21. Are you talking about verses 20 and 21? That's what I thought I heard you say?
I'm talking about all the...
all these of Amad. Obviously, Amad is used in different ways, and so it just depends on the context. Verses 20 and 21, it would be al-kano that is the crucial thing.
This is
in
the
his
key,
place.
actually, because the kano, it's not just Ve'amad by itself, it's Ve'amad kano. So it's paired with he will stand in his place, So that only occurs in verses 3. Well, the kano is not in verse 3, but Alexander is sufficiently narratively explained otherwise. But then it's in verse 7, 20, and 21.
If it doesn't occur in verse 3, it is obviously not indicating all the power changes. That's what I would say. Of course, it is a change in verse 3, but I don't think it is because of just the Ve'amad alone. Mm-hmm. And you just gave other reasons why you see it's a change. So we need to take these other reasons in consideration. It's not just this word which signals like a flag. We have here 4 different kingdoms.
So are we going to move ahead now to verse 20? Is that the...
No. Let's just wait on this. We have Kim Kier here, and then at the back there.
So maybe I can suggest Brother Skinner, did I get that right? Yes. Has said something about showing structure, because there's this structure of these verses 15, 16, 17. Was that? Yes. So verse 13, from what I understand, is the grouping of Philip and Antiochus coming against the south. Is that where we are in verse 13? Yes.
We're in verse 14 here.
Right. So how I see this is what I mentioned before lunch, is that the vision is the vision of chapter 8. And the word established there is similar to stand up in verse 14. So something's standing up that's establishing the vision. And so this could be a new power. And this new power is the breaker and robber of God's people. If you see that there, that is Rome, then the context works. So now you have the king of the north, which is Antiochus, coming and trying to, at the same time that Philip and Antiochus are going against the king of the south because he's just a little kid. This is a good time to take over. At the same time that's happening, well, there's lots of individuals trying to take over the king of the south, and that's historically accurate. And at the same time, this other power is rising, and that's going to establish the vision. And so Rome is just coming off its victory over Hannibal. It takes out Philip of Macedon. That allows Antiochus to go down and try and take out Ptolemy. But as soon as that happens, Rome steps in and nixes Antiochus. So you have from verse 16 then, he that comes against the king of the north, not the king of the south. And the he that comes against the king of the north, Antiochus, is Rome that takes it out. So verse 16 then is not the introduction of Rome. Verse 14 is the introduction of Rome, and then the context works.
All right, what I hear you saying, brother, is that rather than having one dominant power mentioned in each verse, you're suggesting there's a blending of Rome being introduced into the scene while Antiochus is still alive and kicking.
Verse 14 says, in those times. You know, in other words, what's going on here in different other places, all these things are happening at this particular moment. And not only are other people trying to take out the king of the south, but this other power is coming into prominence that's establishing the vision. And then the king of the north is going against the south, but then he that comes against the king of the north takes him out, rather than the king of the north coming against the king of the south.
Okay, Roy?
Yeah, well, verse 14 is sort of parenthetical. I think we pointed this out, we went through this uva etim, so the whole verse is parenthetical about that time. And then it's speaking about the king of the south. The violent among your own people, most likely, would be among the Jewish people. Lift themselves up. They try in their own way to fulfill God's vision, sort of the way Abraham tried to establish the covenant promises through Hagar. You know, they're trying to do it their own way, is the way I'm taking it, at least. But then verse 15, then the king of the north shall come and throw up siege works, and he's then getting the upper hand over the king of the south in verse 15. And then at the beginning of 16, he who comes against him is going back to the same king of the north who's getting the upper hand over the king of the south in verse 15, and that is Antiochus III. So no, Rome, I don't see Rome coming in verse 14. Or verse 16, as I pointed out, Antiochus is still there in verse 17. So it doesn't work to put Rome there before verse 17. Yeah.
All right, we need to move on, Michael, and then we have our friend Brendan.
Very, very briefly, 11:14 should be read in its entirety as if all of what it's describing happens in the broad encapsulated those times. But you see that at the end, they try and establish may not be the best word. It may better be fulfill rather than something firm. But they try and fulfill the vision, but they fall, they stumble. And the Hebrew there is actually the same as in 11:33, referring, which I think we all agree, to the Protestants who try and do things but are not able to do them with power. They stumble. Some of God's people stumble. And so if the stumbling is fulfilled within the time frame that verse 14 seems to be indicating, then there would have to be a good reason to say that this stumbling is by itself, that simple phrase, is projecting way into the future, when clearly at this time it has to be pagan Rome, not papal Rome, because this is very early still. And why would it be then saying within the context of pagan Rome that it's going to stumble within those times? It just seems a logical leap to jump into some far-flung future time to see them stumbling.
All right, Brendan. Okay. We're spending a lot of time on this one question. We need to move on, but we'll take Brendan's comment, then we'll move on.
Sometimes spending a lot of time in the formative areas allows us to spend less time in the later areas. I think that there's a bit of the grammar and the syntax in verse 15 and 16 that seems to be indicative of a bit of an interplay there. You've got the king of the north shall come, and then in verse 15, and then in verse 16, he who comes. Who is the one who's just said to come? The king of the north. So 16 is referring to the one who's just been said to come. And then if you go back to verse 15, it says, the king of the south, the forces of the south shall not stand. In verse 16, it's talking kind of passively about that, saying, none shall stand before him. The king of the north who has just come, none stand before him. And I think one of the challenges, I know that Pastor Lebrun brings this out in interacting and saying that verse 16 is parenthetical of Rome. He says that he shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his hand, in verse 16, and he says, well, Rome did that, but Antiochus the third never destroyed the glorious land. Well, it doesn't say that he stands there with destruction in his hand against the glorious land. The destruction is against the Ptolemaic forces that had previously occupied the glorious land. And just to kind of give something I was reading a little bit, there's a book by author Dov Gera called Judea and Mediterranean Politics, and it describes the interplay during this Fifth Syrian War this is the war where Antiochus, on the behalf of the Seleucids, had finally taken the Palestinian area off the Ptolemaic kingdom permanently. They never got it back. In that period, there was the Jews, and not just the Jews, but the other Syrian natives, they would be very cautious about who they would support. And when it seemed like the Seleucids had the upper hand, they started to throw off their allegiance and come over, except for Gaza. Gaza was an outlier. They threw off their support and came over to the Seleucid side, which means they were trying to fulfill the vision. This vision. Because remember, if Daniel 11 is a continual explanation of the Chazon, it is the Chazon. What we're describing here is the Chazon. So it's an explanation. That's what we read earlier before lunch in Daniel 10, that this is, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen to your people in the Chazon. So they're trying to fulfill it. They're trying to, like Roy was saying, they're trying to do what Abraham did, but it was going to be fulfilled anyway. So can you comment on the 15:16, like the he who comes, there's the king of the north shall come, he who comes. Does that seem pretty solid that it's the same person?
Roy? Or
Anyone?
I actually wanted to say something about the Chazon, so go ahead.
No, I agree with what you just said, which was in agreement with what we were saying earlier. Sure, thank you.
Coming back to what you said in between and your last question before lunch break about the Chazon. I think it is Bernhard Hasselberger. He wrote a dissertation on Daniel 10 to 12 years ago, 78, I believe. And he suggested that he didn't suggest. He summarized that there are 4 different understandings of the Chazon here in this verse. So I give you the 4, and then I say that I don't know. But the first one would be, it's just a Chazon. There is no article there. So it refers to some other Chazon than that of Daniel 8. It is maybe a prophecy of people at that time when this thing happens, whenever verse 14 happened. The second, it's referring to general revelation, like this fulfills what God has said should be fulfilled. And they fulfill that by just doing what they do. Number 3, it is a specific prophecy of Daniel. And then we have to look, which is it? Is it in Daniel 8? Is it the prophecy in Daniel 11 itself? Hasselberger is not sure about that. And fourth, it is a political plan. Chazon used to not say it's a vision, something you receive, being inspired, but it is something which you perceive to be, that is my vision of the political ruler at that time. Hasselberger doesn't decide. I'm not sure. In my dissertation, I see a connection to chapter 8 because the word is similar, but I would not go so far to say it's the vision in chapter 8 which is fulfilled here, because then I really have a problem. Well, what is fulfilled from chapter 8? I can't see what kind of verse would refer to that in 11:14, or do you have an idea?
Does it matter that it says that they failed, that they stumbled, it's not fulfilled?
Yeah.
I think that matters.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. All right. Brother Engel Yoda.
Just a thought.
Can you speak up, Brother Engel, so we can hear you?
I look at the robbers as being the Maccabees, and that they would exalt themselves to establish the vision, the Chazon. But I'm looking at the Chazon to include chapter 9, though that was a moray, it was an explanation of chapter 8. And in chapter 9, you have the Messiah, the 69 weeks, etc., to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up the Chazon and prophecy. And it seems to me that the Maccabees attempted to deliver themselves from the Roman occupation and to establish the vision of chapter 9. And that's just a suggestion that would be their motivation to establish the vision, but they shall fail or they shall fall. They shall not accomplish what they were hoping for in the Messianic coming in chapter 9, but it's referred to as a hazon just because it's inclusive of chapter 9 as an attachment to chapter 8.
Well, for one thing, they didn't throw off the Romans. The Maccabees threw off Antiochus IV, the Syrians, that is the Seleucids. And that would have been a bit later than just not that long after verse 19 in the interpretation that I've been developing. But, since that's parenthetical, I don't think we're going to find a great deal of importance for the overall chapter, particularly the end, by pursuing chazon. There's a bit of a mystery, as Martin said. I agree with you, Martin, that I could see different possibilities. It doesn't have to be necessarily Daniel 8, just because the same word is used. And I don't know what that is, just like you don't know. So we're dogmatically in agreement.
All right, so let us move on with this. We need to get through to some of the later verses here. As we look down through chapter 11, the question arises, for instance, when you get to verse 19 and 20. Let's pick it up at verse 20 here. When I read this, I'm not a scholar. I look at this, and in verse 20, it seems obvious to me, it's self-evident, this is Augustus Caesar taxing the Roman Empire and having everybody go back to their home country, their home city, to be taxed and registered for the census. And we see that in Luke chapter 2 with the birth narrative of Jesus. And as I look across the variety of Adventist interpreters of this verse here, there is a lot of consensus that this verse refers to the taxation of Caesar Augustus at the time of the birth of Jesus. There seems to be, Roy, you seem to be an outlier on this, that the oppressor could be Pompey the Great, who took Palestine for Rome in 63 BC. So the question before us is, in this verse here, there shall arise in his place one who imposes taxes. We've discussed that he shall stand before in this conversation this afternoon. Is this one of those verses that indicates a new power on the scene? Does the language, does the syntax indicate this is a new empire, the transition from Greeks to Rome? And can we really tie this to the census of Caesar Augustus?
Obviously, that's jumping directly into verse 20, but if I may return to verse 17 to try and provide some possible history on why they're connected, why the end of Antiochus III really does lead, as critical scholarship agrees in 17, 18, 19, that is the consensus outside of Adventism, is that this is Antiochus III. Why does that lead into the appearance of Rome in verse 20, or why would it logically lead into it? There has been a lot of confusion over all of the women that appear in this Daniel 11. It's certainly a confusing matter. But here I'm merely quickly summarizing what secular scholars actually see here, and I think it's interesting. So here I am bringing some history into the text to try and make sense of it and why it may make sense to see Rome coming soon after. Why did Antiochus III, after finally conquering Jerusalem and basically ruling Israel as he willed completely, he had complete control over it for about 8 years, but he hadn't eliminated the king of the south. Now, what becomes his major concern, at least according to secular scholarship, historians? What historians see is that Antiochus basically was well aware that the world had been reduced to two major powers, and some of them actually make a passing metaphor to USA versus the USSR. So you basically have now two major superpowers, and that would be the Antiochus III and his Seleucid Empire against the emerging Roman Republic. Now, for some time, for several decades, they didn't face off against each other because they kind of, were eyeing each other. It was a Cold War, and basically they were afraid of each other. They didn't want to get entangled. They knew there was a debated middle ground, but they focused on enemies that were elsewhere. And so Rome, the Republic of Rome, goes and takes out Carthage, and they're fighting and clearing out the back end of their empire to clear the way, for a future confrontation they know is coming with the Seleucids. Antiochus III is doing the same thing. And he is well aware that those Romans are over there, And this is, again, summarizing secular scholarship. So what he tries to do is he wants to make himself look bigger. He realizes, and again, I'm summarizing now what his secular historians are actually saying, who are not even looking at Daniel. So this is just what historians are saying, is they're realizing Antiochus III knows that he needs to prepare for a war with Rome, but he doesn't want to fight them because it's, he doesn't know how it'll end. So what he tries to do first is actually unite the remaining Ptolemaic Empire down to the south in Egypt, which was too difficult and it was just too hard for him to occupy it. He defeated them, but he controlled Jerusalem, which is the important part for the prophecy, but he didn't occupy them. So he tries to, and it only makes sense narratively, starting going back to 11 verses 5 and 6, he tries to unite the empires again. So he wants to combine them and make himself look bigger. No better way than to do it with marriage. And so he tries to unite the empires, and actually some historians describe that as a stroke of genius, because it actually did freeze any antagonistic move by the Romans against them for a short time. However, as historians note, he later got sucked into war on their behalf because some of the debated middle ground Greeks decided that they wanted his help, and so he kind of goes up to help them in the Greek coastlands, and then Rome says, now wait a minute, we have an interest in that middle ground too, and then finally they send a commander, and that fits perfectly, and this is why critical scholarship agrees with this, and then Antiochus III is defeated and humiliated and no longer found. And then it would only make sense, and again, here I'm offering a little bit of history to go with it, that if Rome appears next on the scene, which would be the logical progression, that they would stand up a new power in its place, and they would send an overseer. Now, the overseer is an interesting word, and it probably doesn't really refer to taxes per se. It does more mean overseer. Someone is used in Exodus for the Egyptian overlords over the Jews. But what's interesting about that mere word, that it's some sort of overseering power, is that if it were true that this prophecy is about God's people, which is going to be primarily, of course, the Jews at this point, they had sought to, and indeed did, remove themselves from any overseer. Through the result of the Maccabean revolt was the Hasmonean dynasty, which lasted for over 50 years. It was a long enduring power, and during this time they were completely autonomous. It would be, and here I merely offer it as a suggestion, trying to tie history into the text, it would be remarkable if the prophecy didn't mention it at all. That the whole goal, this is what's going to happen to God's people, and they actually do have a period of almost a century where they are autonomous. And of course, the suggestion has been, and this is by no means, detail is not unanimous among secular scholarship. This is definitely highly debated. But it is possible, and others have suggested, that in verse 14 is saying that the violent sons among the God's people will try and rise up to fulfill the vision. Again, I agree that understanding what the vision means is very ambiguous and difficult. It's possible, if you're trying to read into it from history, what the Maccabeans and Hasmoneans were trying to do is essentially establish God's kingdom on earth and rule it from Jerusalem. So they're trying to restore the temple and restore God's rulership. But of course they fail. And of course Daniel 11, the ultimate purpose of Daniel 8 and 11 is to show that ultimately, and chapter 2 and chapter 7, is to show that God's kingdom will reign supreme. And they're trying to fulfill this purpose of having God rule, but it doesn't work. However, that they try and stand up does represent perhaps the attempted rise of a power of the Jewish people. But then it only narratively makes sense if just a few verses later it ends the story of Antiochus III. He is then defeated, and then the very first thing that is then introduced is the fact that someone now sends an overseer, perhaps contextually, if it's about God's people, to Israel, and now they are subjugated again. So narratively it makes sense. Historically it does make sense. I didn't mention all the details relating to precisely how that marriage alliance failed, but it does. Secular scholarship actually provides a lot of support for this interpretation.
For the interpretation, this is Caesar Augustus.
No, that this would actually be Pompey. Because
verse 20.
Yes, verse 20.
Jerome, you wanted to say something. Go ahead.
Sure. Just coming back to the structural issues, the question that you asked is, do we see a new power? Okay. So if you look at the structure, Va'amad al-Kano, okay, in verse 7, when you have that Va'amad Kano, look at how it's used. It's talking about from a branch of her root. So it's talking about progeny. Again, we have this linear progression of succession of kings, okay? But notice in 20 and 21, what follows that statement? You have a participle phrase. So to me, it's an indication we're not looking at a linear succession in terms of progeny following in terms of a dynasty. So the question that I would ask is why this change? When you expect it to be this succession, you have a participial phrase that's functioning substantively about a person. So to me, this is an indication that we have the introduction of a new power who's not in the succession line of a dynasty. Just wanted to make that point.
Okay, so what you're saying is that this one who shall arise, it's not because we are losing the sense of biological succession. This is a new kingdom arising in this verse here. But the debate is still whether it's Pompey or Augustus.
Does
Yes.
everybody understand his point clearly?
yeah.
From 11:7, it has the same expression for Ahmad, and then it has Kano, that same expression. But in between that, it has Mi Netzer Shorasheha, a branch from her roots. And you're saying that's the difference. This is an intra-dynastic succession within a dynasty, but you don't have that from within the roots. And so therefore it's an interdynastic succession, that is to say something that is not just a continuation of a dynasty. That's your point, right? Okay, I want to make sure everybody gets that, because that's really important. Thank you.
You know, you have the same expression in verse 21. So it makes me wonder, whatever is referred to in verse 20 is soon surpassed in verse 21. And if you have a Roman emperor of any kind in verse 20, it begs the question, who could it be in verse 21? And of course, verse 21 seems to fit the Adventist understanding of Rome because, you know, he goes against the Prince of the Covenant. And so I'm wondering, most critical scholars would see Antiochus Epiphanes beginning in verse 21, but I'm wondering if we could see Antiochus Epiphanes in verse 20, and then Rome in verse 21. Just a thought.
All right. Yes, brother?
I see another option in verse 20. There is a Seleucid king that collected taxes, tributes in his kingdom. He was Seleucus IV, son of Antiochus III. When Rome defeated Antiochus in the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BC, in the treaty that Rome made with Antiochus in Apamea, Rome imposed 50,000 talents of silver to Antiochus. And maybe he paid 1,000 talents, and he died in 187 BC. And his son, Seleucus IV, stand up as king, and he sent one of his officials, I think his name was Heliodorus, to collect taxes, and he paid about 8,000 talents, and he died in 175 BC. And for me, he is the option.
All right, this is kind of an interesting discussion because we're trying to fit different historical characters into the text. And what I'd like to know, maybe some of us here would like to know, is what in the text would suggest one of those characters. And what I like with what Brother Jerome said was that the way that the Hebrew is written indicates that, yes, there is a new king, but it's not necessarily the same dynasty, which would suggest it's no longer a Greek king of the north. It would suggest this is a Roman ruler rather than a Greek ruler, if it's no longer part of the Seleucid dynasty. I hear what you say, brother, but I think we can all try and fit the history into the text. We're asking, what does the text lead us to conclude about the history?
I wonder, you want to continue? Okay. I wonder, you see, the understanding of verse 20 as a tax collector is based on the interpretation of the text as being fulfilled by the Seleucids raising taxes. And what I'm wondering is that what these words actually mean? Okay, Nogesh, Ma'avir, the one who makes pass through, Nogesh Heder, does it mean one who raises taxes? One who oppresses, Nagas, Nogesh, one who oppresses, and Heder is not the normal word for taxes, you know? So could it mean something more like someone who oppresses a precious place or something like that? One who oppresses Jerusalem, for example. And even though Antiochus Epiphanes was of the family of the Antiochus, the reason why many people see verse 21, or many critical scholars see verse 21 as referring to Antiochus Epiphanes, is because he wasn't in line to be king. He was, in fact, an usurper. And so, therefore, the Ahmad al-Kano could apply to someone who wasn't supposed to have been king. Mm-hmm. Just a thought.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in here for a moment. First of all, just to set the stage here, if Antiochus III dies in verse 19, then, and if we have Christ, that was one of the things we talked about earlier in verse 22. We have two verses, verses 20 and 21, between the death of Antiochus III, it's about 187 BC, and Christ. Okay, so that's quite a bit to cover. And we have two, as Jerome was saying, what looks like major successions that are not within dynasties. The reason why I wouldn't accept Seleucus IV Philopater, and I have a picture of him here from Wikipedia on a coin. Seleucus IV Philopater, he reigned from 187 to 175. He didn't reign for a shorter reign than Antiochus IV, and yet it says he will be broken neither in anger nor in battle within a few days. So that means within a short time. He has a very, very short reign, or a very short period. That is to say, the exactor of tribute does. Okay? Now, it's true that Antiochus IV, or rather Seleucus IV, sent Heliodorus. That's why the preterists who believe that Antiochus IV Epiphanes is the little horn, that's why that's translated tax collector. Okay? It's not because the word nagas means tax collector. That can be one of the meanings. It's one of the specific meanings. But I'll show you another place where the same verb appears. Isaiah 53. He, that is the suffering servant, who's that? Christ, was oppressed. It doesn't say he was taxed. This isn't referring to him rendering to Caesar the things that are Caesar's here. It's referring to oppression. And here is the word in the Dictionary of Classical Hebrew. There's several different meanings of this word. It can mean oppress, like the Israelites, exact payment of, to be a creditor, like to debtors. Participle is noun, ruler, oppressor, taskmaster, exactor of tribute, and so on. And it says in Daniel 11, verse 20, within a few days he'll be broken, neither in anger nor in battle. It doesn't really fit Seleucus IV Philopater, the son of Antiochus III, because he reigned for 10 years. And then Tarsee, I know that the critical scholars say that Antiochus IV was a usurper, but if you look at the history, there's really no solid evidence for that. They accused him of that. What happened is that Seleucus IV Philopater, he was assassinated or something, and then his young son died or was assassinated, and they don't know who did it exactly. And then the closest person to the throne was Antiochus IV. He was not a usurper. He was part of the family, and he really continued the dynasty. The critical scholars assume that he assassinated that young son, but there's no real solid evidence for that. So if there's a major interdynastic succession, I would see it moves beyond. And to me, I'll just say what makes sense to me overall, and then we can debate that or not. And that is to say that in verse 20, it's introducing the power. Remember that back when Xerxes attacks Greece and loses against Greece, Greece comes in. Okay, so in verse 18, we had Antiochus III loses against the Roman Republic. It's not Imperial Rome yet, it's the Roman Republic. Then he comes back, and that's the end of him. We would expect the next power could be the Roman Republic. And in fact, the Roman Republic did then dominate a large area, and then they appointed a particular person, General Pompey the Great, to go and consolidate the huge area, Syria, Palestine, Turkey, all around that area, to bring that more solidly into the Roman Empire and to make it all tributary to Rome, so there is tribute involved. And so he goes and he does that. But then, within a very short time, he's assassinated by the Egyptians. He goes, because he's running from Julius Caesar, with whom he had a triumvirate with Cassius. But he's running from Julius Caesar, and he goes to Egypt thinking he'll be safe. The Egyptians, though, think Julius is going to get the upper hand, and so the Egyptians just cold-bloodedly, calculatedly, politically, just murder Ptolemy. So it's not in anger or in battle. They weren't angry with him. It wasn't in battle. They just killed him because of that political reason. And then in the next place, in his place shall arise a contemptible person. I'm seeing the rise of Imperial Rome in that verse. And then you get within the reign of Imperial Rome, you get Christ in verse 22. So that's just laying it out,
all right,
basically.
So you've laid out a good picture of the transition here. Brother Ned's been waiting for a while, so Brother Ed, can you... it's time for a break, so can you kind of keep this succinct?
Sure. So my question was, I think I just got an answer to my question, but the question was, it's been argued by some that to arise in his estate or in his place is a signal for a transition of a whole empire, a whole power. And I was asking the same question that Dr. Li was asking. If we have that in 20, transition from the Greek to Roman power, then when we come to verse 21, where do we go from there? And you're suggesting it's a transition from republic to the imperial. That it's not, for me, it's not real satisfying. It doesn't really, I mean, I think there could be a lot of diversity there, a range of some meanings there. But that was what my question was, and you did just address it.
All right.
Within your viewpoint.
Okay, thank you. We'll take a final comment for our break.
In Daniel 11:7 says, "A branch from her roots shall rise up in his place." Is the same verb form of verse 20, and it also appears the phrase "in his place." The branch who rose from her roots is Ptolemy III, son of Ptolemy II. It's the same dynasty. It's the same dynasty. For that reason, I see in Daniel 11:20 that should be a king from the same Seleucid dynasty. Regarding the noun nogesh, it is true, it means suppress, but it is not the only meaning. It also means tribute.
Sure. However, if you were listening to Jerome earlier, Jerome pointed out that in verse 7, after Amad and Kano, in verse 7, it says, Minetzer Shorasheha. So in other words, the term Amad, and here it doesn't have Al Kano in verse 7, but Amad and Kano by itself doesn't tell you whether it's interdynastic or intradynastic. It's intradynastic clearly in verse 7 because it says so. And so looking at you need this kind of an indicator to tell you it's within the dynasty. But in verse 20, the difference is you have it just simply Ahmad, and it's Al-Kano, and you don't have an indicator it's within the same dynasty. So here would be a transition of the king of the north, Antiochus III. I think this is an important point. King of the north now. The king of the north now is becoming, at least in my view, Rome. Okay, in two phases. The king of the north is taken over. That mantle is taken over by Rome from Antiochus III. That becomes important for later in the chapter, if that's true. Of course, we have to debate that. I'm just saying that I think that.
Okay. But you would agree that if you have it 4 times the ver Ahmad, it is 5 kingdoms which is talking about here. So we should not use Daniel 7 or 8 with the 4 kingdoms as a paradigm for the ver Ahmad. Because you have it
Correct.
4 times here in Daniel 11, which makes five kingdoms.
Well, there are 2 phases of Rome, so it's really one, but it morphs from Republican to Imperial, then later to Papal.
But these 2 phases you don't have somewhere else in Daniel, right?
No, that's true, but of course, as we've pointed out already, you did, and also Tarsee, things are cumulative in Daniel. We have, for example, in chapter 2, we don't have anything about the differentiation of the papacy.
The thing is, he argued, if I understand correctly, that the Ahmad in chapter 7 and 8, the Ahmad not in 7. Oh, whatever. the 4 kingdoms in 7 and 8, or in chapter 2, you can even go there, that these indicate that the Ahmad, or the ver Ahmad, I should say, in Daniel 11 has a structural message, new kingdom. Mm-hmm. And then you go to 11 and look at these and say, okay, it's a new kingdom, but suddenly we have 5. So I cannot use the argument having 4 kingdoms to argue that the ver Ahmad helps here. It might still be, as you say, but it is not a conclusive argument. Am I expressing myself clearly?
Explain why there's 5. I'm not following where you're introducing the 5th.
Well, if you have 4, it divides 5 kingdoms. The first one comes because before was another one, so it will be 5 in the end.
Right. What I actually suggested was that there are 4 major kingdoms. Of course, you have Babylon first, and Medo-Persia, and then you have Greece and Rome. What I was suggesting was that as you look at the chapters, starting in chapter 2, you begin to see that Rome is divided into 2 phases. Clearly, phases. So I'm introducing a new English word to describe what I'm trying to see in the text. So you have 2 phases. You have the legs of iron, and then you have iron mixed with clay. And we understand, and it is the Adventist, standard interpretation, that these are phases, developments, progressions, evolutionary progressions of one power. You have iron, and then you have a diluted iron. Okay, so that's 2 phases to Rome of a major power.
Which phases? Pagan and papal?
Well, I'm uncomfortable with the pagan and papal for a variety of reasons because the terminology becomes confused. And I have a suggestion for why that is from chapter 11. I would prefer to say it's republican and imperial. And that imperial Rome, if you actually are a historian, you understand that it's a very complex power that goes through many internal evolutions. But that's the historian speaking for a moment. But when you come to Greece, it's not at all evident in chapter 2 that it has 2 major phases. That's not clear in chapter 2 at all. It's hinted at in chapter 7, but it's very clear in chapter 8. That it has 2 phases. Alexander, the unifying, founding member of the Greek Empire, and then you have the breakdown into the 4 subdivisions of the Greek power, which are still clearly Hellenistic. They're still clearly Greek. So you have 2 phases. Now, what I'm also trying to suggest is that actually the verb amad does play a special role in chapter 8. And if you actually divide it out and look at it, it does begin to provide a template for how and why we might look at that verb more closely in chapter 11.
Let me ask simply, how many phases are there before we come to Daniel 11?
Well,
like a geological column.
Well, you have Babylon. You have Babylon. Then you have Medo-Persia, which, of course, historically represents a slight multi-phase thing. You have a little minor progression there, but narratively speaking, in the prophecies, is not that significant. So you have Rome, and then you have you have Babylon. Then you have Medo-Persia. Then you have Greece, and Greece has two phases. And then you have Rome, and Rome has two phases. But they're not two powers; they're two phases of the same power.
There's something else to add here, Brother Martin.
6 or 4?
We look back on the Roman Empire and we differentiate between the Republic and the imperial phase. When Augustus became the emperor, we say that was the start really of the empire, but he maintained a legal fiction that it really was still a republic. And he was really the guardian of the republic on behalf of the people. And so we look back at the Roman Empire and say you have Pompey and Julius Caesar in the Republican era, such as Sulla and all the other generals, and Marius. But when Augustus ascends to the throne, he maintains the legal fiction that it is still a republic, and that he is merely guarding the republic on behalf of the people, which was the job of the tribunes in the time of the republic. So we make this neat distinction, but when Augustus comes to the throne, he's blurring the distinctions to justify his power on the grounds that I'm doing this on behalf of the people. And this is still really republic. And so the emperors would still visit with the Senate and so forth, and the power balance changed over the years. But Augustus was maintaining the fiction that it was still a republic. It's time for us to take a break now. And Brother Tarsee, can we take a break?
Well, yeah, what I have to say is short.
All right.
I think it's valid, okay? I think while it's true, and I'm not, I think there's reason for me to change my mind and agree with Roy. But let me go back and point out a few things that are important, though. Just because in verse 7 it's explicitly stated that he's from the root, from the same family. Okay, just because it's explicit doesn't mean that those times when it's not explicit that it must be from outside the family, because then you have to make that explicit too. Okay, so we have to allow for that. The other point I think is important to mention is that we've been trying to figure out an Adventist interpretation here, and that's important for our audience. But I think it's also important to point out that there are reasons why the text may point us away from Antiochus Epiphanes as the fulfillment. You know, not many of you watching here are critical scholars necessarily, but I think it's important to mention that, that we have reasons from the text why we may not see Antiochus Epiphanes as being, the second half of chapter 11.
All right, thank you very much. We're going to take a 10-minute break. We'll join back together at 3:25. We'll be moving on to verse 23, where there is major disagreement. Do we go forward in time from the time of the Roman emperors through to the time of the Crusades, or do we go back in time to the Maccabean alliance? It's a major division point among the various Adventist interpretive streams, so that is what we'll be focusing on when we come back in 10 minutes' time. So let's take a break. If we could invite everybody to come and retake their seats. We have a lot of material to cover before 5 o'clock, and we're not going to get through all the answers in the next 90 minutes, but we'll get through as much as we can. So if you're out in the hall, the entrance vestibule, we'll invite you to come back in. And those of you engaged in private conversations, please bring them to a graceful conclusion. And we're going to conclude our day together by coming into some quite difficult, choppy waters. So thank you, everybody, for taking your seats. And we're going to begin again. Why don't we bow our heads and ask God to lead us once again? So shall we pray? Heavenly Father, we are sailing through difficult waters. We ask that you be the captain of our ship, and that you lead us to a port, a harbor, where we can indeed set down anchor and rest, knowing that you've brought us through the storm. So, Father, guide us now with your Spirit. In Jesus' name we ask. Amen. Right, we've had some discussion about the underlying Hebrew and when does Rome enter into the scene. I think it's indisputable that Rome does enter the scene, and earlier most of us agree that in verse 22, that is the Nagid Berit, the Prince of the Covenant, that is Jesus Christ himself. So we move on to verse 23, and this is a particular interesting verse because this is a junction in some of the interpretive schemes. Just a brief summary. There are some interpreters in Adventism who can go from 22 forward through history. They either move, such as Tim Hayden does, they take us forward through the time of the Roman emperors to Constantine and moving the capital to Rome to Constantinople, and they see a fulfillment of the time prophecy for a time from the Battle of Actium to the shift to Constantinople later on in these verses. There are some who move us forward like Tim Hayden. Others, such as the Islam view, they move us forward through time into ultimately the papacy against Islam in the Crusades as we move on from verse 23. And there are some, such as the traditional, the Uriah Smith viewpoint, and his modern adherents today, who say when we get to verse 23, we jump back to the Maccabean alliance. And we go back from AD 31 to BC 160, 170, 161. And so the question before us now is not what is the correct interpretation of the verse, but is there anything in the Hebrew of this verse, verse 23, that would suggest an onward-going movement through time, or is there something that would suggest that we zigzag back 180 years back to the Maccabean alliance? And so it's really a question of the syntax and the Hebrew and the vocabulary that's used here. Brother Nunez, thank you for your input.
As I said before, biblical Hebrew has several text types. One of them is historical narrative. When the verb wayictol or the verb is imperfect consecutive, the verbal form indicates progression, continuity. And the verb katal indicates a break, indicates elaboration, comment, description, etc. That is in the historical narrative. In predictive discourse, if the clause start occupies the first position, wekatal, that also is known as dakatal consecutive. The verbal form wekatal indicates succession, continuity. If the next clause initiates with a particle, a noun, but not a huecatal, indicates a break. The verbal form yictol indicates elaboration, comment, etc. In verse 21, we have the verbal form huecatal that indicates succession. The next verb is, let me see, verse 21. Es uva in verse 21. The next verb is uva, is a huecatal, indicates succession. And then in verse, oh, there is another one. Huehehasik is also huecatal and indicates succession. Okay. In verse 23, that clause, the first clause, doesn't initiate with a huecatal form. It says umin. It has a waw or vav, like others pronounce it. It is a waw plus a preposition min. That means that that clause doesn't progress. There is no succession. There is no continuity. That's one thing. The other thing is that in biblical Hebrew, when the author or the speaker wants to introduce a new participant, indicated through a noun, not through a pronoun, like in verse 23. The verse says, and after an alliance is made with him. Who is him? The function of a pronoun is to point backwards to a participant that already was introduced. And it doesn't indicate who is the person or entity that makes an alliance with Rome. The pronoun is Rome. And in Hebrew, we cannot introduce a new participant with that pronoun. It points back to Rome.
So where it says, and after the league is made with him,
yes.
The him is referring to Rome.
Yes.
But then it says, he shall act deceitfully. To whom is the he referring to?
Okay. The implied subject in the verb is the same him, Rome. Rome shall act deceitfully, and then adds, and shall grow up, is a huecatal verbal form, it shall grow up and shall become strong with few people. For me, this clause is indicating the beginning of Rome, the beginning of the contemptible person. We could understand that phrase, shall ascend to power with few people.
So what phase of Rome are you talking about? Are you talking about Romulus and Remus in the very beginning of Rome, Roman history? It seems strange here that after Christ dies in the time of imperial Rome, which we know is in the time of Tiberius Caesar, that you have here, and I agree with you on the syntax, it has to mean from the time that an alliance is made with him, still referring to imperial Rome. He, imperial Rome, shall act deceitfully.
Yes.
But then how does imperial Rome now become strong with a small people? Because already it was a huge empire. So there's something missing here.
Well,
help us out, Michael.
Okay. The text indicates a beginning with few people. For that reason, I don't believe that refers to Papal Rome. That's one argument. The other one, when the preposition mean is used at the beginning, that indicates something backwards or forward.
Is that a question or a statement?
It is a question.
All right.
That I suppose, according to your interpretation, that umin here goes forward.
It does. Following that is this hitpel infinitive construct, literally, and from making an alliance to him, or that is with him, and that would be from that time moving forward.
Okay. If that is true, I found in the book of Daniel, in chapter 12, verse 11, I would like to ask you if the first phrase there, umet, indicates forward or backward, because it is the same construction. Can we read the passage?
I put it up, and from the time that the tamid, because the translation says regular burnt offering, it's just the regularity or the regular in Hebrew, is taken away, is removed, and so it's from that time and moving forward.
Okay, from that time that tamid is taken away, and the abomination of desolation is set up. There shall be 1290 days. According to the context, in verse 10 says that many will be purified, whitened, and refined. The wicked will act wickedly, but none of the wicked will understand, but the wise people will understand. Then comes verse 11.
Yeah, Brother Nunez, can you make your... as far as I understand you, you're saying that the Hebrew of 11 verse 23 is indicating a forward motion in time. Is that the summary of what you're saying?
No, for me, it doesn't indicate forward. For me, it does indicate backward, as in Daniel 12:11.
All right, so Brother Tarsee has a response to that. Do we have Brother Nelson?
I
Brother
don't have a response.
Brendan
I think
as well?
I can explain a little bit of what you're trying to say.
Yes.
Okay, I think just as in chapter 12, it meant from the time that, and perhaps you're suggesting that in chapter 11, verse 23, it should mean from the time that instead of after. Is that what you mean? Okay, okay. Yeah, that's, yeah. I do have something else I wanted to say, but that's separate.
All right.
If you're not done, I'll wait.
I'd like to
Thank you.
comment and raise for us to discuss another, what I see as a key aspect of the Hebrew that should be looked at and is often ignored. And that is that, of course, it is umin. That's a vav disjunctive, and we're discussing that. But then the verb to follow, hithabarut, is a hithpael form. And so that, as I understand it, means that it's reflexive. I would like to see some more discussion about what it means that this verb, typically alliance, union, in English we just say it as if it's a simple thing, but if it's a reflexive verb, that means it's kind of perhaps a unilateral action, and I'm curious what we all think or how it works there.
No, the root meaning is to join, and so the reflexive definition is to join together, to make an agreement. So that is the hitpael meaning, is the alliance, making an agreement or a mutual joining together. That's the hitpael meaning, not, it's not unilateral. That's the point of using the hitpael here.
Mutual. I put the definition from Helot, Hebrew and Aramaic Lexicon of the Old Testament, up there. Here's hitpael. And of course, what a particular Hebrew root means in a given stem, like hitpael, is a lexical matter. It depends on the particular word. But here, Amanda is absolutely right. To make an alliance is in the hitpael, or have a partnership with. So here it's two parties making an alliance with each other.
Okay, Brother Tarsee?
So the idea of reciprocal or reflexive are two sides of the same coin. It's reflexive if you're talking about yourself, but it's reciprocal if there's more than one person involved. You're doing it to each other. But I wanted to, if I may, come back to some of the things Samuel was talking about. I wonder if it would be in order to just simplify things a little bit, because our audience does not necessarily know Hebrew. And they don't know the fact that Hebrew scholars are in so much disagreement over what some of these things mean, actually, okay? So just try to simplify so they can see it themselves too, okay? You can see it if you get some kind of a Bible program, or if you get an interlinear. The basic word order in Hebrew is, and here again there are disagreements, but as we see it, is verb initial, meaning you begin the sentence with a verb. So normally it's the verb, then a subject, then the object, and so on, okay? Which simply means that's the way you talk. In English, the order is subject, verb, object, okay? So what's the significance of that? The significance of that is when the writer departs from that word order, then it becomes significant. It means something. Either it's a parenthetical statement, or it's a background statement, or circumstantial, or maybe it's introducing a new topic, you know, but then it becomes significant. Otherwise, you know, it just continues the story. I think that's the best way to explain it. To give you an illustration, we can do the same thing with English. In English, for example, I can say, I read Hebrew. Well, that's a normal sentence order. But if you hear me saying, Hebrew I read, then all of a sudden it must have there must be a reason why I'm putting emphasis on it. And that goes back to what we're talking about in terms of the syntax. Okay, don't worry about the exact verb form we're talking about, because that gets too complicated for us. Anyway, sorry.
The only importance of the huecatal form is that it indicates succession, continuity. In this clause, there is no succession, there is no continuity, because it doesn't start with a verb.
All right, Brother Ed, I know you have some distinct views on this, this verse.
I won't share the distinct views, but I will just share something I discovered when studying this verse. The Septuagint reading, the Theodotion translation of this verse, actually seems to indicate that this league, it doesn't even say league, it uses the same word that it uses for berit. The berit in the previous verse. So it's when it says after the league that is made, it's actually referring to the covenant that the prince made in the previous verse. I think that's very interesting, and I actually have taken that and I have built something on that. But I do believe that, because Jesus said that, this is the cup, the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for many. And in Daniel 9, he's going to confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. And I believe that this reference here, this league, it's a possibility that it's a reference to the previous verse where the prince made the covenant.
Okay, Brother Jerome.
I just wanted to let you know it's been a blessing. By God's grace, we'll see each other tomorrow.
Okay. Thank you. Brother Brenton at the back there. Thank you very much, Brother Jerome. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you. Thank you.
Just a response. When you mentioned the Septuagint, there are two major translations in Greek of the book of Daniel. One of them is what we call the Old Greek, and that is usually called the Septuagint in this case, and that's the one that has the word covenant, diatheke.
I'm projecting it, by the way. You can see it if you want. Here's the Septuagint in Greek, and here's the word diathekes, covenant right there.
There is also another translation of the Septuagint. The Old Greek departs quite a bit from the Hebrew. There's a lot of interpretation there too. There was a later translation done by Theodotion, which was also early, and it follows the Hebrew more closely. And in that one, you simply have the coming together, making an alliance, but not the use of the word diatheke. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that.
Well, and I'd also like to add that in the Old Greek, there is no, you mentioned in verse 22, the mention of the covenant. It's not mentioned there in the Old Greek. It's mentioned in Theodotion, as you said. But the word used in verse 22 is diathekes, which you have in verse 23 in the Old Greek. But in verse 23 in Theodotion, you have a different word here. You have synanomezon, which means to be joined together or in league with. So neither of those translations actually uses that diathekes in both verses. So just a clarification.
All right, Brother Brendan.
Is it possible that this change in verbal form at the beginning of verse 23 indicates not a leap into the future, but somewhat of a parenthetical situation similar to what we were talking about in verse 14?
It can indicate a parenthesis. In verse 22, that clause doesn't indicate succession also, because it doesn't start with a huecatal verbal form. it only indicates general statements. Armies will be destroyed before him. When? It doesn't say. They shall be broken. When? It doesn't say. Also, the Prince of the Covenant, it doesn't say when. We know it. Why we know it? Because in Daniel 9 indicates when the Prince of the Covenant would appear and when would be killed.
All right, thanks. This is the reason I'm asking this is important. It seems like verse 22, 23, and 24 to me are giving like a broad overview of the actions of the vile person or the contemptible or despicable person.
Yes.
And one of the important things that I know should be looked at is it says with a small people, we become strong with a small people. This word is different from the arm that is used of Daniel's people throughout the chapter. This is Goy. This is the Goyim. This is a different group of people. It's not the same as the wise people, the Maskalim Ameka. It's a different group.
Yes. Yes.
So the way I've started, like I did at one stage just by going, way back when I was just looking at the English, it looked like the same, people. But then you go to the Hebrew. My current thinking is that this is giving kind of an overview of the time, and it was mentioned before, the emperor deceitfully took over, saying that he was going to protect the republic and the small people. Could the small people be the Senate? Perhaps that he becomes strong with the small people, the Senate. He makes a league with them, and then he acts deceitfully with that same small people.
Well, when you have the word goy, it doesn't mean people, it means nation or like an ethnic group. So I don't know that it could necessarily apply to a subset within a specific group, because the Senate, that would be talking about specific people in certain positions, not a distinct ethnic group. So I don't know that you could use that
But
word to indicate like the Senate.
But the Senate were they were considered Roman citizens. By this stage, Roman citizenship had taken on a new ideal, and the Senate was representative of the entire nation.
In order to gain our bearings, thank you very much for that. That's all ideas are welcome. We have to consider all of them. Maybe just for a moment, we can consider the context here overall. Look at the big picture where we're coming from and heading to. Verse 22, if we agree that that's the time of imperial Rome, the death of Christ, right? Tiberius? I think we all agree on that. And then verse 31, did we agree that that is we're now to the papacy in verse 31? So somewhere, we had the similar issue before with the Seleucids and Ptolemies. Somewhere, Rome comes in. Now, somewhere in here, there's a transition from imperial Rome to papal Rome. And the question is, where?
Yes.
That's the question?
Yes.
Now, that's a historical question, but I think if we have those anchor points, looking at the language first, then looking at the history, seeing that those two then are in progression, then in between here, we have to look at it and say something by the time of 538 or something like that, when Rome is fully developed. Michael's done quite a bit of work on that. You want to talk about it?
Well, we'll maybe come to that in a minute, but I did want to make a broader comment because, again, we do have texts where we generally do agree. And I just would like to offer one line of support that does build off of what Dr. Nunez has been suggesting, and that is that it does matter how sentences begin in Hebrew. There really is something there that we should be paying attention to. And one of them, just like, for example, in verse 23, we have umin. We actually, it indicates a vav disjunctive, as has also been suggested. And I just wanted to briefly mention why, for every Adventist interpretation, this does have significance. And that is because in the first half of the chapter through verse 19 and 20, 21-ish, there are not very many Vav disjunctives. They only occur in verse 6, verse 10, and verse 14 to begin a new verse as we have it divided now. So they're somewhat of a rarity, and what they do represent is some sort of scene shift. Something shifts in the picture. Some sort of narrative shift. It can involve time. It can be a parenthetical information surrounding the context of the scene, but there is a scene shift. Well, they don't happen very often in the first half of the chapter. It's pretty much Vav consecutives and very direct narrative prose. And so the story is being told very straightforwardly. And where they do occur actually do indicate the rises of particularly important narrative figures. In verse 10, for example, Antiochus 3 is a particularly important figure, and most Adventists see him introduced there and proceeding for several verses. In verse 14, we all agree that there is something unique happening there around those times, and that is introduced with a Vav disjunctive. So you do have a scene shift. This is important. In the second half of the chapter, now that I've made the point that there aren't very many Vav disjunctives in the first half of the chapter, in the second half of the chapter, from verses 22 onward, there are lots of them. This is important for every Adventist interpretation, if I'm allowed to speak confessionally for a moment, because there's no doubt that in the first half of the chapter, we're only covering about 360 years or so, and about every verse represents, I'm just using math here, simple math, about 19 years a verse. That'd be about one king per verse, give or take, even though that's not how we subdivide it, because we see some narrative features at play. But you can see how it would represent a very tight chronology, and this is something that we share in common with historical critics, so we have to acknowledge it. We do see tight chronology here, very direct progression. In the second half of the chapter, we do see Rome in there. Almost all Adventists do by verse 31, certainly. And how do we explain then the huge jumps in time and the narrative, the total narrative shift and structural flow in the second half? Well, there are lots of Vav disjunctives, which is telling you, and they begin verse 22, verse 23, verse 24. You have a key preposition in verse 27, verse 29, verse 31, verse 35, verse 37, 38, and then 40 again begins with a disjunctive. This indicates, at the very least, that the narrative is moving in a much more herky-jerky way. This is in the text, and those who are reading it, looking at the disjunctives, and I don't mean herky-jerky in the sense of it is certainly shifting. That doesn't mean that we're right and that it's moving hundreds of years at a time all the way to 1798 and 1844 and beyond, but it certainly does indicate that the scenes are herky-jerky in ways that have not been fully explored by historical critics and may allow for Adventists some jumps in time.
So I understand that there are some people here who argue that we go forward in time. Some of us see very, very quickly that papal Rome turns into papal Rome within these verses, and we start to see the Crusades, the fights against the King of the South, in these next few verses. Others, such as Uriah Smith and the John Whitcombs and the Neo-Uriah Smith groups of our era, they take us back to the Maccabean Alliance. And the question just at this stage is, among the scholars, do you see anything that takes you back in time in that verse 23? Is there anything that would take you back in the text, or do you see that the text keeps flowing forward? That's the essential point. I know we have a couple of points here.
Well,
yes, Pastor.
Maybe we could just see if there is anyone that has that opinion and let them speak. Otherwise, silence can be...
Mm-hmm. Does there anybody here who sees the jump back?
Just triggering on your comment about the disjunctives there, I think also that there is a chronological flow forward until 20, 22, and so on. But then with all these disjunctives, question back, do you see that as still following a chronological order, or is that introducing maybe even a new thematic order?
It could be both. That will require further study of the text. Disjunctives, and I am the least qualified in Hebrew of the people up here, but it is something I've just been looking at and trying to understand. But it does represent, as I said, a kind of a little bit of a scene shift. The scene shift can be part of the same narrative, and it can be chronologically very tight depending on the narrative, depending on the story being told. At the same time, in something like this, where most of us agree that we're talking about a prophecy that involves huge jumps of time, at minimum of 20 years per verse, up to 100 years per verse, certainly it provides the possibility that there's going to be a narrative that is told through specific scene shifts that are the heart of what the narrative is telling. In other words, the narrative's not interested in every 10 years this happened, every 10 years this happened. It's interested in specific events through history. So it's following some themes through history that may be strictly chronological or may not be. That would depend on further analysis of the text.
So the answer to my question is nobody is here arguing or sees a compelling reason, even if we go from tight chronology to thematic episodes, nobody is seeing in this text a valid reason to jump back suddenly in time, which would probably be the first time that occurs between Daniel 7, 8, and 9. It doesn't happen before in prophecy in Daniel. Why would it suddenly start happening now? And so, Brother Nunes, if you don't, do you see a reason why we should jump back in time?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. It indicates that the contemptible person would ascend to power with few people, indicating beginning. In verse 24 also says that the contemptible person shall devise plans against strongholds. If the contemptible person devises plans, it indicates he is at the beginning of his power, making plans to take strongholds.
All right. Yes, Brother Tarsee?
We may be asking the wrong question. I mean, the fact that you have a shift from predominantly verb initial clauses to many clauses that are non-verb initial might indicate the shift in the type of discourse you have. So whereas you had a narrative, although it's future-oriented, but it's a narrative in the first half of this chapter, perhaps this part of the chapter is descriptive, which means the author may not be looking necessarily at what follows what, but simply it's like in chapter 7, when you get to the description of the throne, then all of a sudden it's no longer events following each other. It's just various statements that describe the throne scene. And so it could be that when we come here, the which follows what may not be as relevant to the author. And the distinction between pagan and papal Rome might not be as important, actually, to the writer of Daniel. We are trying to separate them. But who knows whether Daniel is necessarily trying to describe them separately.
I'm displaying something, by the way, here, and that is a word. I did a word search on Bashalva, because here in Daniel 11, verse 24, it says Bashalva. Without warning, it really means in tranquility, in a time of tranquility, when people are at peace and not expecting anything. So I just did a word search on that. And here I find a connection with Daniel 8:25. By his treachery, he will succeed through, here's a key word, deceit, mirma. He will have an arrogant attitude. He will destroy many who are unaware of his schemes or in tranquility. Same expression here, although they've translated it differently for some reason. And then we had the same expression in 11:21, which would be in the time of imperial Rome, that is to say, if we accept that 22 is the time of Christ. And then here we have Bashalva. In fact, before that, let's see, here's the despicable person to whom royal honor has not been conferred, and he will come on the scene in a time of prosperity or in tranquility, and he will seize the kingdom through some kind of deceit here. So now we're getting to another use, the third use of Bashalva in the book of Daniel. They'll arise in his place. Well, no, hang on, verse 24. I've got to move this English up here. In a time of prosperity or a time of tranquility for the most productive heirs of the province, he'll come and accomplish what neither his fathers or their fathers accomplished. So it's clearly referring to, this is a pattern going on here with Rome, both imperial Rome and pagan Rome and papal Rome, that it's deceitful and not using military force to overcome, but rising up in a clever way, in a politically clever way. And then, of course, significant, we have to put into the mix perhaps the context here. He shall stir up his power in his heart against the king of the south. Who's that? That's a crucial question. And of course, we notice we haven't seen the king of the south for quite a while. Last time we saw it, it was the Ptolemies that was defeated by Antiochus III. Why haven't we seen a king of the south? There hasn't been one, because Rome took over as king of the north, but then it subjugated the Ptolemies, the king of the south. Now we have the re-emergence of the king of the south. And of course, historically, the Roman Empire did split north-south. And so that could be significant. It could be before that time that we have verses 23 and 24.
You're obviously talking about the Crusades, with Islam controlling the southern half of the Mediterranean basin and the Romans controlling the north.
It's one possibility.
All right, but before we get to that, Brother Kim Kier, thank you for your patience.
The word league, just wanted to go back there in verse 23. Can it be more than just a treaty? Can it be some kind of an actual alliance? And I guess it's translated there in that whatever version you have up there as an alliance. Because it's translated in verse 6 as they join themselves together. So it's something there seems like it's more than just a treaty. It's something where they're doing something together. Other places, it's when it talks about in Ezekiel chapter 1, where it talks about these cherubim or whatever angels the name was, where their wings are joined together. So it's like they're becoming one. And so this alliance here is where this leader and this group of people are joining themselves together to work together as one, not as kind of two separate groups that just have a treaty between each other. Just wanted to say, could that, where we see an actual joining together, where there's an alliance, where they're working together as a unit, so to speak. Maybe they're having their own agendas, but they're more so as a unit than separate entities that just have, a treaty, one with another, north and south, or Canada and the United States have a treaty, but they're still separate.
So I think the issue here is more the English translation rather than the Hebrew, because it's actually, it means a joining together. And so when we use the word alliance, we're using that as an extension of that meaning. But then, whenever you translate into another language, you're bringing in baggage with whatever word you've chosen to use. So yeah, we're bringing in all this baggage. What does an alliance mean? An agreement or a treaty between two nation states that may only last for a certain amount of time. But that's not what the verb means at its core. But alliance is an approximate translation, but it's not perfect.
Yeah, you can have the idea of partnership. I put again here the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament with the relevant form, and here it shows up in red, the verse that we've got. In 2 Chronicles 20, verse 35, and I've put that up, you can see it on the right-hand pane. I'm blowing it up. After this, Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, Hitchaber, that's the same form, joined with. He made it's a partnership. Made a partnership with Ahaziah, king of Israel. And then that's reiterated in verse 37. In verse 6, of course, you have these king of the north, king of the south. They didn't dissolve their individual identities, at least at this point, but they had a partnership. So, however, presumably that could be a very tight partnership. It doesn't say how tight the partnership is. It could be that they actually did blend, but of course, Are you suggesting the possibility that this could be a blending of Christians and pagans, as in the time of Constantine, that became the papacy, and it took a while for them to actually merge to become one? They were sort of separate, but then they became closer and closer? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, I'm suggesting that there's a possibility here of Rome, after the cross, an alliance. The Treaty of Milan, and where there was an actual physical treaty or alliance, that stopped the persecution. And as far as the western part of the Roman Empire, Christians were a very small group of people. They were mostly all Christians were in the eastern part of the empire, and there was very few in the western part of the empire. And so that small people, coupled with Constantine, really grew, and then over the course of time, that set the stage for the transition to Papal Rome in verse 31 and following.
Okay, Brother Greg, back there. Okay. And we'll come to you, Brother Nunez.
Yes. Is this on? Okay. I'm looking at the earlier parts of Daniel to help us with this a little too. When you look at the 10 horns that come eventually unite back in 7, and also in Daniel, the 10 toes of the statute. We know that that when pagan Rome fell into pieces, that eventually took quite a while, quite a bit of much history before it united under a single faith, which it did miraculously. And so I'm just, that's something else that Daniel if they were continuing the story from the previous things, that might be part of the story here.
Okay, thank you, Brother Nunez.
What I would suggest maybe another way of looking at these verses, starting with verse 21 and onward, and that would be to see, yes, the fourth kingdom, going from verse 21 up to 45. But instead of seeing it maybe making the distinction between pagan or papal Rome, seeing it from the perspective of Daniel. He saw this fourth kingdom acting before the time of the end and during the time of the end. Those are the two phases he sees. He doesn't see a pagan Christian, but he sees a before the time of the end and during the time of the end. And that might help us maybe connect all these pieces where we would like to make a clear-cut distinction between these two. It's the same power, but acting before the time of the end and during. And then on the disjunction or prepositional phrases, circumstantial phrases, I can see also not just maybe a description of characteristics of this power, but also it slows the reader, at least. Mm-hmm. It slows me down. And so it makes me look more intently instead of just running through the text forward, because one verb, then the next. It slows the reader down, and what is this? Why the change in the syntax? And that might be another way of emphasizing the importance of this fourth kingdom.
Yes, we're in the middle part of the chapter where from verse 22 to about 31, that there's great diversity of opinion. As you look through all the Adventist interpreters, it's very, very hard to see any common flow in how we interpret this. And partly our discussion now is reflecting that the great diversity of opinion that there really is here. But it seems from our conversation this morning that by the time we get to 31, we do see that this is what we call Papal Rome in its persecuting mode from verse 31 onwards. And so we're really discussing time from Christ through to pagan and persecuting Rome, and how does each verse fit into the history? Now, there is one stream of thought. It's the Islam view, and you've raised this, Roy, just briefly. We find that in the passage here, the king of the south in this discussion from 22 to 31, the king of the south just reappears in verse 25. And he's disappeared for a few verses. So we have only 45 minutes left. Can we focus on this for a minute? How do we interpret the arrival of the king of the south? Because the Islam interpretation, for want of a better phrase, argues that this is the papacy in the north against the Muslims who are coming from the south. They control the southern half of the Med Basin. How do we interpret the reappearance of this king of the south? Yes, Michael.
Well, to build directly into verse 25, and I think, Roy, you mentioned a few of the comparisons earlier, but a lot has rested on the identity of the vile king in his appearance and then in the immediate following verses. And what you noted is that a lot of the words that are used in Daniel 8, 23 to 25, appear in Daniel 11, 21 to 25, or 27, actually, all before verse 31. That has been the primary reason that some of us have chosen to see the papacy before verse 31. And that would require a little bit of a more complex use of the vav disjunctive to see some thematic developments to try and tell a much broader, a bigger story over a greater period of time than some have chosen to see. But one other connection intratextually with Daniel that is not a parallel with Daniel 8, but I think is significant, is in verse 24, it says, "And he will do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers." This use of the word fathers is very interesting. Of course, it also appears in verses 37 and 38, which most Adventists, some Adventists, not all, by no means, but some also see to be referring to the papacy as well. But there's some divergence of opinion there. But the question then just simply stands, as I've asked it, is why would this reference to what his fathers have not done appear in verse 24? If you are just looking intratextually, and I do not consider this by any means a final word, but it is interesting that the previous time that fathers was referenced in Daniel, which is within the broader context of chapter 11, is Daniel's prayer in chapter 9, where he is asking forgiveness for the sins of our fathers. That's the last time it appeared. So in that sense, it's the Jewish people. It's God's people and their fathers who are doing what they've should not have done, and now they're doing what they've never done before, even above and beyond. Clearly, it is something that is viewed in a negative context. And my question is, and my suggestion would be that perhaps already we do have a reference to God's people appearing here. And that, of course, that requires an understanding of the previous couple of verses, particularly verse 23, as the alliance might be between the leader of imperial Rome and the Christian people. If it were between the leader of imperial Rome, who was the holder of the title of Pontifex Maximus, and the Christian people, then you would see a very natural introduction for the idea of the union of church and state through imperial Rome into Holy Rome, or the papal Rome. And if that's the case, then you have in verse 24 someone masquerading as the leader of God's people, who is now doing things that in a manner that the sinful forefathers of God's people have never done for quite some time. He is scheming. He doesn't seem to have unilateral sole power now for some reason that is unclear. My suggestion is, if you're wondering where I'm going, is that something that happens for some time would very naturally lead into the understanding of the papacy and his role in helping facilitate and create and manipulate the rise of the feudal system. They did this actually from the breakup of Rome. Basically the feudal elements were already in place, and this involved one castle scheming against another castle, and this was an excellent way for the papacy as a leader of the feudal system to scheme against people, spread the riches around, conquer one castle, etc., make trades, deals, treaties, and forecast his devices against the strongholds for a time. It is, and here between 24 and 25, we do have a vav consecutive indicating that 24 and 25 are narratively linked directly. We do have then a logical reason for why this king would now have his heart arise, which is another parallel with Daniel 8, 23 to 25, which we understand to be papal Rome. His heart arises, and then circumstances develop such that he is now faced with the task of a new southern foe.
Okay, so the arrival of this king of the south in verse 25 who had disappeared from the chapter early on, he suddenly reappears. How are we expected to interpret that? Is it a literal, geographical king of the south, or are we moving towards a more spiritual understanding of these things? And as we were talking about yesterday with Brother Brendan's presentation, so this is not necessarily a literal king of the south, such as the Muslims, as they were, or do we understand it in another way?
I believe that from Daniel 11:21, we are entering into the participant as a figure of language. The participant in verse 21 is a contemptible person or a despised person, but that person is not literal. It is not a literal king of Syria. We have come to the conclusion that that contemptible person is Rome. If it is Rome, then that name, Nipse, is not literal, is a figure of language, is a metaphor.
Maybe I'll pick up on that. In verse 21, Uriah Smith interpreted this as Tiberius, because during Tiberius' reign, Jesus died. Rather, that's verse 20. Yes, and because in verse 22, Jesus died. In verse 21, it appears to be the same person. And therefore, Uriah Smith called this contemptible person to whom royal majesty has not been given. He said it is Tiberius. And then he tried to, Uriah Smith magnified all the faults of Tiberius, which of course were many. But it's really very unconvincing, that interpretation, because number one, Tiberius wasn't anything as bad as Caligula or Nero, who followed. And furthermore, he was given the royal majesty. He did become the emperor legitimately. He was not a usurper. This is speaking about a usurper here of some kind. Now, I think perhaps picking up on what Samuel is saying is that this could refer to not just an individual, but an office. So it's not symbolic in the sense of something nebulous, but it's referring to a whole chain of emperors, which could make quite good sense here. Now, one question to raise here is, of course, coming back to Kim Kier's presentation yesterday, there is no question that this is the third interpretation of the symbolic vision of Daniel 8. And as an interpretation, it needs to be basically literal, otherwise it doesn't explain. You don't explain a symbol by a symbol, right? And so if there is any typological element, it would be within that framework, and it would be secondary to that interpretation. As far as typology goes, we can talk about that later perhaps, but maybe I'll just mention one thing briefly. I do have here some of an article by Dr. Richard Davidson, The Eschatological Hermeneutic of Biblical Typology, in a journal called Theorema 6.2 is the journal issue, and then it's 2011. So Dr. Davidson has pointed out some hermeneutical controls for recognizing types, and that would include things like in the Old Testament, you should recognize the type by the profile of what's going on, and then there's going to be other verbal indicators, verbal indicators there, and also later OT indicators, and then you have the New Testament announcement of the antitype, and so on. And so he's got these controls here, and he's got a number of examples of how that works, and it's really convincing. I'm not seeing that type-antitype relationship anything close to what he's talking about in Daniel 11. I'm not seeing that. Now, we know from elsewhere, of course, that Israel becomes a type of the church in a sense, but there's continuity, but I'm not seeing this kind of type that Dr. Davidson's talking about. I'm seeing some repetition of history. I mean, taking Palestine, Antiochus III does that, Rome does that. Ultimately, then, we have that challenge at the end of the chapter. We have the gap going against another power. losing to it, and then the text moves to that power. We have these patterns, but I'm not seeing typology anything close to what Dr. Davidson is talking about.
Is it possible, based on what Brother Nunez was saying, that this is not a literal person? Yesterday, Kim Kerr's presentation saying, no, there was a vision and then there was a literal interpretation. That's the pattern we find through the book of Daniel. The Roman emperors viewed themselves as the embodiment of Rome themselves. And so we may argue that, is this a literal individual? It may well be a literal individual, but the Roman emperors saw themselves as being the embodiment of Rome. In that case, they wouldn't necessarily say, they would maybe agree with Brother Nunez here, that it's not an individual, it's the system of Rome, and the emperors who are literal and physical and literal are the embodiment of Rome during their reign. Brother Valiant, you have a question for us?
Some of the proposals that I've been seeing continue to see this idea of this goy as being like a small group of Christians, but the arm is the word that's used throughout this chapter for the Israel, whether the Israel genetic before verse 22 or the transcendent Israel after verse 22. To use goy, there'd need to be some extra support for this word. I think it's based on the fact that both are translated people in many English translations. It seems there's a contrast between the small people in verse 23 and the people of God throughout the rest of the chapter. That's number one. The other one is that it's been mentioned that by the time that the vile person comes on the scene, he first took over the mantle of King of the North, but then he subsumed the territory of the King of the South. That's correct? Someone mentioned that before, I think. So by the time the vile person comes on the scene, he is the King of the North who has, he first took over the mantle of King of the North, conquering the Seleucids under Pompey, but then also annexed the entire Ptolemaic Empire. So when the King of the South re-emerges on the scene, would it not be natural to see a dividing of the same kingdom that had united King of North and South? And it's interesting that at the time of Constantine, just before Constantine, there's actually a similar situation that you have for the division of Greece. They had arranged Rome as a tetrarchy. Tetrarchy is a division of 4, but 2 of those became the dominant once again. So out of the 4, 2 are becoming dominant, just like out of the 4 divisions of Alexander, 2 became dominant, North and South. And so this, to me, to jump into the future at this point, rather than go, okay, let's stay chronologically progressing at the point where Rome is now dividing again.
Mm-hmm. All right, Brother Kim, you have a response to that?
No, I'd just like to affirm that and recognize that at this time, as Brendan is saying, there's Rome is split, and Licinius is in the south, and he has just taken over all of that area of North Africa and Egypt, etc. And he's the one who initiates the attack against Constantine, which is what is here. And he does it with a much, much larger army than Constantine, but Constantine defeats him. So that's works there for the King of the South being whoever controls that area, which was Licinius at the time, and then anyway,
I'm having trouble seeing this being a civil war in Rome. There were other civil wars among Rome between, for example, Mark Antony and Lepidus, right? Between Octavian and Mark Antony and so on. These were civil wars within Rome. But this is speaking about 2 separate kingdoms. I would see this more as the homeland, the heartland of Rome is in the north, and then a southern part of the Roman Empire completely breaks away into a totally separate government, and it never comes back. And that would be the Islamic conquest, because that was the whole southern part of the Roman Empire broke away.
Mm-hmm. Right. All right, so let's just ask that question, because it seems there are there are two broad interpretations here, or at least three. One of them is that this is the rise of Islam, the king of the south. The other is there's a split in the Roman Empire around the time of Constantine, and the civil war that arose, and then the shifting of the capital from Rome to Constantinople. So as you and Roy and Michael, you are proponents of the Islam view, could you summarize for us in a couple of minutes why we should believe that this king of the south, who just appears as just in the text, why we should take this as the rise of the Islamic power? Why in this verse here, 25?
Well, of course, this is complicated. I was just suggesting why a little bit before, that if you follow some of the textual hints that are at least in the text that connect 8:23 to 25 with Daniel 11:21 to 25, so this is all before verse 31, then you have someone that is all of a sudden interested in, or has elevated himself with the same language, practicing deception, working deceit, gaining power through peace. All of these are mirrored in chapter 8. And then verse 24's hint that he'll be doing what his fathers have never done. If this is sufficient to create the possibility that we see the Pope here, or the rise of Christendom, verse 24 explains this very well. Rome is a divided. You see him scheming against different powers, strongholds, and so forth. This is clearly a Rome that is divided internally. And so he's working against the internal mechanisms of Rome. And so part of the question that has just been raised, is there any internal intrigues and civil wars in Rome? Well, yes, it's right there. It's right there in the text in verse 24. But in verse 25, we now have something that causes him to raise his heart in a special way. He's going to be elevated in a special way. The only thing that would make sense following the fact that there are lots of disjunctives here in 22, 23, and then 24 and 20, and then you get one back in 27 and then 29. But if 24, 25 are a logical flow, and we've had some possible jumps in time through 23 with the rise of the papacy, and then 24, how he gains power, and then 25, the Pope's first real existential enemy, in the sense of challenging his overall global dominance. And this is kind of the key, that it does become a global religious conflict, is Islam to the south. Nothing challenges the papacy the way that Islam does. What's interesting, again, if you step back, and I'm bringing, again, forgive me, some history into the text when we try and do this, because without history, it is very difficult to interpret the text by itself. But what's interesting is that the papacy really didn't care. I'm talking here about the Latin Roman Christians that were developing there in Rome, really didn't care when Islam began to overtake Eastern Byzantine Rome, the eastern half of the Roman Empire, Byzantium. They really didn't shed a tear. Most of the Sabbatarians, by the way, were at this time, as the Christian church developed, were in the eastern half. The Pope didn't shed a tear when Islam began to take over Jerusalem and then began to take up into the areas of Turkey today and so on. They didn't care. Same thing over on the far left, while Spain, as we understand it today and for a long time, has had a close relationship with the Catholic Church. At that time, they were not central to their concerns. And so basically the Pope was interested in simply consolidating power for himself. What happens as Islam begins to make its advances into Christendom is that all of a sudden the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, realizes that they're falling and that they're in trouble, and they actually appeal to help to the Pope. Help us. And the only figure left standing who was strong enough to do anything in the western half of the Roman Empire was, at this time, now we've arrived to the 1000s, was the Pope. There was no other political figure that could actually rally Western Rome together to try and quote-unquote save Christendom. Of course, as history would show and reveals to us, the Pope really didn't care about Eastern Rome at all. And later on in the Fourth Crusade, they captured Constantinople anyway, and they have really no real interest in Eastern Rome. And so the story really is about the papacy. And if the story really is about the role of the Pope and his major antagonist, that can only be one figure, and that is the Islamic power to the south. No one else can do what the narrative says.
Okay. Thank you. Brother Nunez?
The problem that I see with the Islamic interpretation is that in verse 21, I heard that introduces Rome. And the only action of Rome against the people of God is that Rome destroys the Prince of the Covenant. And then jumps to the papacy and then to the Islamic religion. But in verse 30, it speaks that that entity, whoever it is, that entity goes against the Holy Covenant. And what we understand as Holy Covenant. The Holy Covenant first has to do with the Jewish people, first. Then, after Jesus, comes the new covenant. And verse 30 and other verses following, that entity deals with those who transgress the covenant or forsake the covenant. What people forsook the covenant? What people transgress the covenant?
Well, if Christ is the Nagid Brit, then it's his covenant. And so the covenant is not simply with the Jewish people, it's with the Christian people at this point. Now,
let me continue. Then, in verse 31, we found that the army of that entity attacks the sanctuary, the stronghold, and also takes away the Tamid, and then set up the abomination of desolation. I find in the New Testament that Jesus spoke about the desolation, the abomination of desolation. Luke, commenting on that event, he doesn't mention the phrase abomination of desolation, but indicates that the Roman army is the abomination of desolation that would desolate the temple, the city, and would destroy God's people. For that reason, it's difficult for me take the Islamic interpretation seriously. Because
based on what you're saying, brother, in verse 31, the abomination of desolation, you would place that in AD 70.
Excuse me?
You would place the abomination of desolation, taking away the daily sacrifice, in verse 31. Based on what you're saying, what I'm hearing you say is, you would then place that with the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple by the Romans.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
That's a very, very different timing. It's a very, very different timing. I appreciate how you're tying that in with how Jesus describes the prophet Daniel. We have two comments out here. If we could go to Brother Brendan first. This is a very interesting perspective on this. And before you start, Brother Brendan, as we're going through this discussion, I'm thinking of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And you're going through the decline of Christian history, the apostolic era, the persecution era, the compromised era, and then the dead era. And it may well be that these verses are charting the parallel history, because the four horsemen of the apocalypse deal with God's people. And this passage is also dealing, it seems to me, ultimately with God's people and the forces around God's people. And in that perspective, Islam doesn't figure at this stage of the history just yet. But you raise a very interesting point. Brother Brendan and then Brother Tarsee. Please keep your comments short because you only have 20 minutes left. Brother Brendan?
With regards to the abomination of desolation, I see it as having connection to the question that's asked and answered in chapter 12, and it's given with the time frame of the 1290. And so for me, it's around the 508 at the point at which that is set up, as it is here. I'm not saying that there's not an abomination of desolation Jesus spoke about. I'm just saying they're different abominations of desolation. But my question to those who are promoting an Islam idea, we've gone through how no one up there, except for Samuel Nunez, saw any reversion, any going backwards in verse 23. So make the case why there is this going forward in history, because I've read a lot of the Islamic ideas, and they go into like 1000 AD and beyond, and then by 31 you're coming back again to the beginning of the setting up of the abomination around 508, the same as how I see it. So if there's no going backwards, if you don't see you going backwards in verse 23, why do you see you going backwards sometime before coming back to verse 31 with the papal persecutions period? Make the case.
There's a difference in this kind of going backwards, because there's no going back in Daniel 11 within any power, the time of any power. You have the time of Medo-Persia, then you have Greece, then you have the four kingdoms, and then you have Rome, various phases perhaps. And here we're all in the time of, at least within what we've been talking about, the time of papal Rome. And if you see in Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, the culminating point for Rome is this religious arrogance, this blasphemy, which also here, it wants to culminate with the religious. But before that, it seems to be topical in the sense that it's talking about the religious, or rather the military political aspect, and then moving, and we've had this, he mentioned feudalism, you've got the economic and all the rest of this stuff, like the other powers earlier in the chapter. But then we're getting, at the end of the chapter, the unique element, which, yes, it does start, and of course you do have a disjunctive syntax at the beginning of 31, forces from him shall appear, uzroim, so it's disjunctive, this is background now. Forces from him appear, back in 508, and then of course this lasts much longer after the Crusades. The Crusades began in 1095. Urban II, Pope Urban II called the Crusades in 1095. So if you want to talk about going back, there's that sense in which it would go back, but what I'm seeing is a topical treatment, and how else would Daniel do that if he wants to climax with the religious part? The religious part started back there, it goes all the way through, and it climaxes later, and in fact the military part is very crucial for the question, the question of the whole revelation in this chapter is in Daniel 10:14. We have to keep that in mind to make you understand what is to happen to your people in the latter days. What happens to your people? That's these persecuted faithful ones, right? Who are delivered by Michael when he stands up. And what did the Crusades have to do with them? Much in every way. It's because the military power that the papacy developed by these alliances through the Crusades, then it turned on Christians. It had already started to persecute for a long time, but then really you get going. Innocent III destroys the Albigenses, right? All this kind of stuff. That's after the Crusades have begun. And so it makes really very good logical sense. It's not going back to a previous power, whereas Uriah Smith does go back to a previous power. We're not doing that.
So you're saying that the disjunctive is the justification for going backwards within the same power. Does that happen anywhere else?
No, and the thing is, going by the context of this, we have to ask the question: what else could it be in verse 25 if it's not the Crusades? What event could it be that would involve a massive campaigns back and forth and so on and so forth that would engage it an existential conflict with Rome. The only thing in history like that was the battle with Islam. And modern historians are saying that Islam is the only power in the history of the papacy that threatened it existentially, not once but twice. That is, threatened to wipe it out. There's no other power like that.
Our interpretation, and I want to follow up on this because
to keep it brief, we have a lot of questions on this point.
Okay, well, I'll come back to it because as readers of Daniel 11 will observe, there are not very many place nouns and proper nouns and unique words and so forth. You have Egypt back in 11:8, and then of course the highly contentious appearance of geographical places in 40 to 44 and so on. But in the middle of the chapter, there's very little specific language. One of the key features of the chapter that drives our interpretation is actually found in 29 and 30, which deserve special attention because they actually have specific words. It has a specific kind of ship. It has Kitim, a place name, the only place name in the entirety of the whole central portion of the chapter. And so they are worth special attention, and we'll come back to them.
Okay, thank you. Brother Nelson?
I was just going to mention that when Samuel mentioned that it was pointed back to 70 AD, that the prophecy that Jesus talked about in Matthew chapter 27, or excuse me, chapter 24 and verse 15, was dual-fold. And we're told that that actually applied not only to when Rome came in 70 AD, but also during the papacy period.
Okay, thank you. It's a very helpful comment. Brother Nelson at the front.
I've got a question on this.
Brother Rosenberg. Brother Rosenberg. Brother Nelson waved it away. I thought he was asking. Okay. Brother Rosenberg. Oh, Brother Tarsee, did you have a comment on that?
Well, I have a question because, if you, and I have to admit, I don't know what these verses are talking about when you get to this part of it. But if you see Islam here, verse 25 seems to suggest that it's the king of the north who starts a fight against the king of the south. Whereas if you're trying to fit history into this, we're trying to start with the text, what the text says. If you try to fit history, and it's possible, like I said, I don't know what it's talking about. But you'd expect the king of the south to be the one to initiate this.
If I may comment on that, and again, that's where history might paint a different picture than might be portrayed in the common perception. It is kind of the common sentiment of the West and Christendom and Europe and so forth for the last several hundred years to see the Islam as the aggressor in the Christendom versus Islamdom debate. When it comes to the narrative of Daniel 11, I am suggesting that when it comes to the leading political figures of Islam and it comes to the papacy, that it is the papacy that initiates the fight. And that is actually reflected in history because the papacy is only really drawn into the struggle when the Eastern Christendom asks for their help and the Pope sees an opportunity to expand and enlarge his influence over Christendom, and he doesn't really care about the Greeks anyway. And so he really is the one that calls for the Crusades and initiates it. And so that would give a little bit of a twist to how the narrative is told in the Western European history.
Okay.
I put Wikipedia up here. Pope Urban II preached for the First Crusade in 1095 at the Council of Clermont. You just look it up in Wikipedia, and that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, who started the Crusades is a debate we could have all day long. Sure. Brother Greg?
And so chronologically, if we are sequential and we're not going backwards in time, assuming that is the papal power and the Pope Innocent III did a couple of critical, it was the pinnacle, most historians will agree that the Pope Innocent was the pinnacle of power for the papal system. And it started to come down gradually over time after that. And there's two key events that happened during his time. One was the taking of Constantinople, the sacking of Constantinople in 1204. They were still keeping Sabbath in the Constantinople. That was the head of the Eastern Orthodox faith, as well as Sunday. And they put an end to that. They came in, and it was a terrible sack. And along with that also came not long after, the Fourth Lateran Council made transubstantiation became official dogma of the Catholic Church. Okay, Wycliffe saw that this was the abomination, recreating the sacrifice of Christ. Every time they have a mass, was perceived by some, and so it was the pinnacle. Okay, and it started earlier, of course, and went on later, of course, but it was the pinnacle. There are 3 places where you find the abomination of desolation, that phrase, 9:26 and 27, where it was fulfilled. Jesus saw it coming. It was in Daniel 9. 1131 chronologically takes us to the middle, roughly the middle of the papal power. And then there's another occurrence at the very end of time that we have yet to get to, which would be lovely if we could.
Okay, thank you, Brother Doug. Pastor Tim.
Okay. The question was from Brendan about evidence, to go back. In your paper, you talk about Daniel 8 and the masculine, feminine pattern. Well, if you follow that pattern, it shows up in Daniel 11. You have a mix of the pattern in 21-22. Then you have the little horn power is the papacy. Then it comes back to Rome and proceeds with the papacy when it gets the force of arms. And in verse 31 is when the papacy gets the force of arms. So it's actually prefigured in Daniel 8 that you're going to have a focus on the papacy on one phase, you go back to Rome and go forward again. It's already in 8.
Okay, thank you, Pastor Tim. We only have a few minutes left. There is a question that some have asked me to ask, and it is this. In verse 24, it says, "He shall enter peaceably, even into the richest places of the province, and he shall do what his fathers have not done, nor his forefathers." And at the end of the verse it says, "but only for a time." And people have written to me on my email and said, could you please ask the question, does this phrase "for a time," does this refer to a time period? Because later in the prophecy in Daniel 12, we have a time, times, and half a time. Are we to understand this as a 360-year period? Because that may help locate this in history. Or is there another phrase used in the Hebrew that would not indicate this as a time prophecy in the middle of verse 24? It's a question that's coming in via email, and it may help us with dating these prophecies. Brother Nunez.
The Hebrew word that is translated as time is the Hebrew word et. And the word et can mean a moment or can mean a period of time. But never in the Old Testament the word et is used in the sense one day for a year.
All right, so when it says a time, times, and half a time later in the prophecy in chapter 12, it uses a different Hebrew word.
A different
moed
word.
Okay, yep. And those words are not syntactically linked, they're not synonymous,
no.
They are just completely distinct.
Moed really means an appointment. And you notice in the book of Daniel, terms where a day is for a year, it's using unusual terminology for time, like Idan in the Aramaic, and so on. Or in Daniel 8:14, Erev, Boker, evening, morning, and so on. They're always unusual terms. 8 is a very common term for time, and that's not used for a day year.
So do any of you Hebrew scholars see this phrase, but only for a time? Do you see that as being a prophetic time component there within the prophecy? Do any of you see that? No. Okay. Brother Nelson, did you? No? All right. Yes. Brother Martin?
Daniel 11 itself is a prophecy. Yeah, so all these time references, and I think we have looked at Ahmad, we have looked a little bit at Keno. There are many other semantic fields in Daniel 11 we have not looked at specifically. Maybe the semantic field of time. You have Moed, you have Ed, you have Ketz, Itim, which is the plural of Ed, and these things. We should look at these as well to see if they give us what kind of time structure they would give us.
Moving on, just to look at the verses themselves and try and separate them from history, it is very curious to look at the narrative flow, just trying to read it from verses 24 right before verse 25. There is a vav consecutive there, so there's a reason to read 24 and 25 initiating the same story, all the way through to verse 28, which seems to be the end of a sequence. And most authors, actually, most people, no matter what history they try and apply to it, do see that in the narrative there. It is quite curious, and again, I'm trying to offer some more general and generic support for the Adventist perspective here, contra those who see Antiochus Epiphanes in here, because the battle has a particular kind of significance. There are hints of time. Verse 24, we have a word for time. It is used a couple of other times earlier in Daniel, and it usually does indicate a flow of time, but not a prophetic time. It actually does occur earlier in the first half, although not indicating as much time as we may see here. But when you get into 25 and 26, you do have a peculiar engagement. It's quite complicated, and I'm only just going to try and rough ride through the narrative to explain why it's complicated, and of course I think that it does fit a certain historical set of circumstances. You have a king of the despised king. I prefer not to call him the north because it's not there at the moment. Fight the king of the south. It's a particularly large engagement right from the text. Very mighty engagement. It actually is somewhat linguistically unclear which one doesn't stand, for schemes will be devised against him. There actually is some discussion over that, whether it's the despised king or the king of the south. But what's curious about that is in 25 or 26, it continues, those who eat his choice food, presumably the one who doesn't stand, will be destroyed, and his army will overflow, and many will fall down. But the choice food does bring us back to Daniel 1. The words that are used there are actually the same as the ones used for Daniel and his companions, who are given privileged status under the king. They're given choice food, so it does seem to be a context of literal choice food as well as education and privileges. And that's a very curious arrangement, because it seems to be on only one side that the narrative is discussing. I think narratively it makes more sense that the despised king would be the ongoing protagonist of the story, and that he's the one that doesn't stand. To me, that makes sense, but narrative or linguistically, it is a very complex case here. It's very difficult, and translators have seen it both ways. I will just pause on that and leave it alone. But what's curious about the narrative is that it says one doesn't stand, but then as it continues, 27, but both kings, and it certainly seems to suggest narratively that this is the despised king and the king of the south. That would seem to be the implication. Both their hearts will be intent on evil, and they will speak lies at the same table. So this is somewhat of a context of kind of an impasse. Neither one can really seize the victory. And then it says very interestingly, for the end is still to come at the appointed time. And so it seems that it's leaving this conflict unresolved. There's still something to come to resolve this particular conflict. 28, then he will return home. The reason why I favor the despised king is the one who doesn't stand and who have people betray him that eat his choice food, is because it proceeds with just a pronoun. And it seems to be carrying the protagonist through the narrative as the despised king. He's kind of the main figure of the story now. Clearly from 21 on, 24, it's talking about the despised king, narratively speaking. There's been no new introduction of a special figure. And then in 29, it says, at the appointed time. There's a simple question that you do have to ask. Is 27's appointed time and 29's appointed time, are they actually directly fulfilling each other? I don't think so, but that comes from verse 29 itself. And that's where I want to kind of take the conversation now in our few remaining minutes here. In 29, it says, at the appointed time, he will return, again proceeding, unfortunately, with the infinite number of pronouns here. He will return and come into the south, And in Hebrew, it actually is a little bit more complicated. The King James Version is the only one that really gives us a flavor of the Hebrew. And it says that he will come to the south, but it will not be as it was before, Rishon, or afterwards, Acharon. It uses those two words paired together. You only will see that in English translations, basically, in the King James. So it so happens that it preserves it. This is very curious because it actually seems to indicate that there are three encounters. That there's the one that just took place, and then there's the one that's taking place now, which narratively seems to be in 29 and 30, and then it gives the suggestion, Acharon, the last the last one, that it seems that there is a yet future one that kind of leaves the narrative standing still. If we have time, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I don't know if you can quite make that argument because you have the ka, inseparable preposition, and usually when you have a comparison between two things, it will have the ka on each one. So as the first one, as the second one. So it's saying it will not be as it was for the first one for the latter one. It doesn't mean afterwards necessarily. It means after the first one. So you can, so I don't know if you can make that argument that there's three encounters.
I mean, I will suggest on this one that there is some ambiguity there, because narratively speaking, the second one doesn't conclude anything either, because it's asking for an end and there's no end. So, narratively speaking, it's asking for an end from verse 27 that does not come. But
so just what I hear you say is you're making a statement about major geopolitical events on an ambiguity in the text.
That's debatable. Well, we can talk more about it.
Those were your words on an ambiguity.
There are many ambiguities in this narrative.
All right. Okay. So it's 5 o'clock, and we've come a long way through this text. I don't know about how you're feeling, but my brain is feeling rather stretched. And as we've been going through today, I've been looking at the spreadsheet that is available online with all the main Adventist interpretations side by side, realizing where there are such significant differences in these middle verses of this passage. But as we've gone through, I've sensed there's some greater clarity on some of these issues, that there's a general sense the prophecy moves forward in time, Brother Nunez notwithstanding, but there's a general sense it moves forward in time, and that there is the realization that how do we understand this prophecy relating to the people of God if everything after Calvary really is understood in an antitypical way, as we heard yesterday, or do we still retain these physical, literal actors going through time, a physical manifestation? So tomorrow we will continue. Tomorrow morning we have two sermons. They're both different sermons. And Brother William Fagel will be speaking again on Sister White and Uriah Smith during the Sabbath School class. In the afternoon, we'll pick up again at 2 o'clock, and we'll go through to 5 o'clock. We will pick up at verse 36, which is the king. That is a major dividing point in interpretive scheme of things. Is that king the king of the north, or is it the papacy, or is it the French Revolution? That's a major dividing point, and we'll be exploring that verse to start off tomorrow, before moving on to the heart of the matter, which is 11 verse 40. And particularly, when is the time of the end? Is it 1798? Is it 1844? Is it after that time? Because that dating has a critical impact on the various interpretive schemes that are out there even today among Adventists. So we'd like to give a round of applause to our scholars today. Thank you. And we want to thank Pastor Kelly and the village team for hosting us today. Thank you, Pastor Kelly and Pastor Joe and everybody else.
And Conrad has done a tremendous amount.
Oh, thank you. And maybe Pastor Kelly, would you close us out today?
Let's stand together and ask God to bless us. Thank you, Lord, for a very wonderful journey, stretching us, helping us to stop and refocus again where so little focus has been for so long. I'm praying, Lord, that you'll bless everyone with rest and readiness for the Sabbath. We're thanking you, Lord, that we still have some wonderful high places to go to. I pray, bless each of the presentations tomorrow, the 2 different sermons, the Sabbath school, and then the afternoon session. Now, Lord, we are grateful for your presence among us. Bless everyone that watches this yet in the future online. And for those that have been watching, Lord, we pray, may many thoughts and much mental, spiritual energy be focused again on that which is promised to bring us revival. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.